Here.
Bob Cowell.
Here.
Charlie Palisano.
Here.
Amy Pennington.
Here.
Heather Rogers.
Here.
Jen Bluestein and Brian Balcom are not here. And Rick Tainter, chair here. And now I'll turn over to Councillor Dan to welcome the joint public hearing for the Planning and Development Committee side.
Thank you, Chair Tainter. So I'm Chair Shand. This is a committee of the whole item, 2 items tonight. We have the introduction of the ADU ordinance 179. Since we have the whole council, we have Councillor Preston and Councillor Wright are here representing the Planning and Development Committee. We have Councillor Donahue, Councillor Harmon, Councillor Khan, and I see Councillor Z in the audience. So we'll open the committee in the meeting and get started. So we can start with ordinance 179.
And do the proponents wish to make a presentation at this time?
Yeah.
Confusing my.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay on this? All right. Yeah, my name is Afroz Khan, Counselor at Large. I'm here with the co-sponsor of this ordinance, Counselor Harmon. And what we would like to do is, before we jump right into the ordinance itself, we'd like to introduce it. And we've kind of split this up into a few talking points that we wanted to run by with the group to give some context. I will start off and then I'll pass it on to the co-sponsor to actually walk through the ordinance itself. So if we could go, yes, so the talking points that, I'm going to go through the purpose of the ADU ordinance. I want to talk about the in-law apartment zoning that we currently have, since that's the one that we're modifying. So I'm going to spend a slide or so on that. And then I'll talk about the ADU state regulation, which a lot of it is actually prompting the action that we're going to be talking about tonight. So really important context, just one slide. I hope folks can see it. If not, I'll quickly touch on the high points here. But really the purpose of the ADU ordinance, it really lies into what we currently have in our zoning ordinance that talks about accessory dwelling units. At that time, we called it in-law apartments. Now, in-law apartments were also in 1989 is when it was added into the zoning ordinance. And really, in terms of being an ADU or an accessory dwelling use, the few caveats is that it was really for an attachment to your house. So there was nothing with a detached in-law apartment. It was really related to, expanding your house or being attached to your home as a separate apartment. The other things that in our zoning, which I'll talk about, it really was limited to specific family members. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but that was the original, but I would say the ADU ordinance that we have today. Now, in the 2013 Housing Production Plan, which came after the state created a pathway for communities to look at like a 5-year strategy of housing and housing production and focusing on affordable housing. So the very first housing production plan was actually in 2013 for Newburyport. And in that, it was actually mentioned as one of the policy updates was to update the in-law apartment ordinance. It was repeated again in 2018, and our most recent one repeats it yet again. After that, though, actually the most recent housing production plan for my counselors who were there yesterday when we got a walkthrough of the 2024 plan, one of the staggering figures that really pops out is in the last 10 years, we lost 300 rentals in the community. So one of the things that kind of triggered, I guess, what we're going to be talking about today in terms of getting now some updates done to our zoning ordinance is that the Massachusetts state regulation passed in August of this year with new definitions that talk about what an accessory dwelling unit is and identifies certain conditions that we'll talk about that you will see reflected in the ordinance. So we go to the next slide. An important piece that I really want to talk about because it connects in terms of what the city already has for an accessory dwelling unit. So really the only thing that we have to point to that is the in-law apartment zoning. So what I did is I pulled out some of those key aspects of the in-law apartment zoning. I mentioned before select members of your family. So really for the homeowner's parents, parents, children, or grandchildren by blood or marriage. That's the limitation of who could actually be in the in-law apartment. It's allowed by special permit in districts where single-family use is allowed by right. We'll talk a little bit more as we look at those table of uses. And also in terms of the area, the dimensions, if it's an existing in-law apartment, the maximum square foot is 900 square feet. And if you are building an addition to create an apartment, 700 square feet. And as I mentioned before, no detached structures were allowed in our ordinance as it is. Parking requirements, one additional parking space was a requirement too in our zoning for an in-law unit. And the main thing that I kind of want to talk a little bit about is how many active permits today do we have for in-law apartments? And talking with the planning department, it's 7. So we go to the next slide. The table of uses is really an important table that we all go to in our zoning ordinance because it helps us understand where certain things can be built in our community, where they exist. So if you look at the residential use table in our ordinance, what I've highlighted in the red block is the in-law apartment. And as I mentioned, it's really allowed by special permit and in those districts where we said single family could be allowed by right. And what I also want to point out, what I highlighted in bold, the very top row is single family. And as you can see, the P is where it's allowed by right. Right below it is 2 family, and after that is multifamily, and then over 20 units. But one of the things that this table helped me see, because I did not edit it, this is the whole list of items under residential use. What it helps one see is where exactly in our community are what we call residential districts, single family residential districts as well. Like R1, if you were to take a look at that, R1 in our city is where a lot of single family homes are. And then if you look at R2, you see now 2 family homes with special permits. So it gives you kind of a lay of our community in housing. And just to refresh for some of you, many of you guys might already know it here at the table, but P means it's permitted. So the zoning administrator of the city confirms compliance. That's what we mean by permitted. It's actually approved by our zoning administrator. When we say NP, not permitted, it's pretty straightforward. SP is special permit. So it requires public board approval. So if we go to the next slide, just really quickly, I know we all love this map. It's so colorful. It's like, where are we now? So we should put a big star where we are, but this is to give you the array of colors, like R1, which is the one I said has really our single family homes. That's the very pale, different shades of yellow are here, but let's say it's the very pale shade of a crew. So that is where residential R1 is. We can go. I'm not going to spend more time on this. I just wanted to give some context on that. Now, the other key things to be mindful of, and we're going to get into this when we talk about the ordinance, are dimensional requirements. What I'm showing here, because remember, we're following the story of the in-law apartments, because pretty soon we're striking them out. But let's see what that story is behind them. The dimensional requirements for in-law apartments are the same as single-family homes. And what you see in that table are those dimensional requirements. Which do what? They tell you the height of structures. They let you know lot coverage by percentages, open space. And we can see here in the different zoning districts where different kind of parameters have to be followed for dimensional requirements. The 2 things to take away from here, and this is more like notes in terms of just what are some takeaways when we talk about new structures, new residential like single family homes. Well, new structures have to meet these requirements. If they don't want to or they can't, that's when they go to the ZBA for a variance. For existing structures that don't meet these dimensional requirements, and there are very many in our community. If you look at actually some of these R1, 20,000 lot area, 20,000 square feet lot area, many of us could think of homes that don't meet certain aspects of these dimensional requirements. Those are called lawful, pre-existing, non-conforming structures. So again, this is just to give some language. We're going to hear it as we talk through the ordinance. I want to do a quick little refresher on that. So the next slide here talks about the state regulation. So now putting aside the in-law apartments that we talked about, let's look and see with accessory dwelling units, what the state did in August is they did a definition. So the first one here is the definition defined in chapter 40A, section 1A. And this definition went into effect immediately when it passed. So what it does is it actually says that it's a self-contained unit that must have cooking, sanitary, and sleeping. So that means a kitchen, a bathroom. That really is an accessory dwelling unit. And it must have a separate entrance from the outside, or it could be through a shared corridor. So, we see that as attached as well as detached. The second thing, and we've seen with actually the limitations with our in-law apartments, it has to be the lesser of 900 square foot or half of what the primary dwelling square footage is. And then the final thing is that, one of the additional restrictions, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but local control for municipalities, we could prohibit short-term rentals. And we all know our short-term rentals anyways, we have an amortization, but we can, and we are prohibiting STRUs. So that's the definition. Now, another part is we have section 3 in also our Massachusetts general law that's now honing in on specific types of exemptions or permitting aspects for ADU. And this is important. And this is the big piece, is allowed by right in single-family residential zoning districts. One of the things that's noted here too that's important is, and I'll highlight it, and the first one is no zoning ordinance shall prohibit, unreasonably restrict, and require special permit for a single accessory dwelling unit. The second key part, and we'll talk more about this, is that ADUs may be subject to reasonable regulations, one of which including site plan review. Also regulations concerning other dimensional setbacks, bulk, height of structure. And finally, I mentioned before, prohibition on STRUs. I believe, and a few more. Actually, this is also still from the state, is that owner occupancy cannot be required. And that is something I didn't mention for in-law apartments. That was also an assumed requirement. Parking allowances maintained what we saw with in-law apartment at 1 per dwelling, and actually only a maximum of 1. You cannot increase that. However, if the ADU is less than half a mile from some type of transit, commuter rail, subway, bus station, then you cannot actually impose a parking requirement. And then of course, one ADU is the one to be permitted by right, but a second one, if you choose to do so and add a second one, it has to be a special permit. Right, so moving then to the next part, I'm going to actually turn it now over to Councilor Harmon to talk through the ordinance itself. But what I've done so far, that background, and what the state has actually regulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Khan. I'm going to try not to put you to sleep as I take you through the proposed ordinance amendment to the zoning ordinance related to ADUs as we've interpreted for Newburyport. As part of this process, I want to call out, that my fellow co-sponsor and I have tried to, responsibly interpret this state regulation for Newburyport in collaboration with members of the Planning Office, City Hall, as well as the legislative working group of the Housing Choice Coalition, in order to gather input and shape something that hopefully satisfies our needs. So the zoning that we have proposed is going to first change the so-called in-law apartment use with a new title, accessory dwelling unit, consistent with the Affordable Homes Act. According to the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, communities that don't regulate ADUs or explicitly prohibit ADUs will be regulated by the new state ADU provision. And for Newburyport, that means that the in-law apartments ordinance will no longer be enforceable after February 2nd of 2025. For those of you with your phones out, that's a Sunday, but it will likely go into effect the following day, which is a Monday. So as co-sponsors, we had some objectives here, obviously revising the outdated in-law apartment ordinance, allowing owners to rent out their primary or accessory dwelling, or existing or new, to provide needed rentals for the community, as well as additional income and the option to downsize potentially for seniors. This doesn't scratch the surface of the potential permutations of a given family. However, a family is defined. As you saw earlier, there's some outdated language in the in-law apartments that this gives us the opportunity to move beyond. It also models those state regulations in developing bylaws that meet the requirements set forth to not unreasonably regulate the creation of ADUs. It addresses areas where the state regulations can be balanced with our local context, and it reviews current practices for single-family dwelling alteration and applies thoughtful policies to the new use of an accessory dwelling unit. So this gets into what we have proposed in the amendment, starting with, as you saw earlier, the larger table of uses down at the bottom shows how we would revise that. So we're striking out in-law apartment and replacing it with accessory dwelling unit. We're striking the special permits or not permitted to allow or permitted use in those zoning districts which allow single family by right. In terms of the allowable uses, it replaces in-law apartment and with reference to additional requirements in section 22. Also, it updates our dimensional requirements to replace in-law apartment with accessory dwelling unit and deletes the previous requirements. It adds a new table footnote for the dimensional requirements applicable to accessory dwelling units. It also contains yard requirements, so any accessory structure containing an ADU will comply with setbacks applicable to the principal dwelling. And a maximum of 2 accessory structures, excluding pools, may be permitted on a parcel within a residential zoning district. So for example, if you have a garage and you wanted to build an ADU, you would have 2 accessory structures. So the next slide, this is sort of a side-by-side comparison. So we've given you a lot of background. So going from right to left, the pink is our current in-law, which needs to be updated now. In the lighter blue in the middle is what the state has recommended, and on the left in the darker blue is our proposed ordinance. So we are essentially allowing one ADU, similar to the one in-law, the difference being that ADUs could also be detached as opposed to inside the dwelling or attached to the dwelling. The zoning districts where this is allowed, in-law, as we covered, is a special permit, which is more difficult, and the state is telling us to allow these by right, where single family is permitted. So we are updating to be in compliance with that. Also where there exists a lawful non-conforming single family.
And if you pause there, just to pause there, what that means though, we saw on the table of use, anywhere there's a P, we're saying, that's where it's permitted by right. That second statement though, is all those other districts where there is a lawful, non-conforming single family unit or a single family dwelling. So keep that in mind. It's not just permitted in those districts we mentioned. This is a key aspect too that's in here.
Thank you. Dimensional requirements are essentially the same, single family or primary dwelling across the board in each of the 3 scenarios. For definition, we covered the new definition, a unit that functions separately from principal dwelling in the primary structure or attached. Do you have somebody with a question?
Sorry,
Attorney North.
Attorney North, did you want to?
Apologies, I hit a wrong button. Please ignore my hand. I took it down. Sorry.
No worries. We just wanted to confirm. Thank you. Apologies.
Thank you for providing some relief so we keep everybody awake. Going back to the chart, so on E, we're talking about gross floor area. This is the size allowed. They're all very similar. In the in-law apartment, there was the distance between an existing where you could build a 900 square foot or new, which would be limited to 700 square feet. The state law and our interpretation for Newburyport, both 900 square feet or half of the floor area of the primary or principal dwelling, whichever is smaller. The bedroom limit, there is no guidance and it's not addressed in the first 2 of the existing. We are imposing a 2-bedroom limit in our proposed amendment. Additional parking required for an additional ADU on a property. We are imposing a limit of 1, which is consistent with the in-law apartment, and not more than 1, which is the state requirement. And then for a parking exemption, to note, if you are within a half mile of MBTA or other transit station, you you get an exemption from the parking requirement. So that people would be using the public transportation.
And the addition, sorry, and one other thing caveat to be added is, you could get a parking exemption if you are actually putting that rental unit and making it actually applicable to be listed on the subsidized housing listing. And that is something we added in here. So it's not coming from the state, but kind of a condition, a carrot per se, to get someone to actually make these affordable.
To explain just a little bit more about that, so the subsidized housing inventory is part of how we are in safe harbor from a 40B, which may be part of the second part of the meeting tonight. So we thought it would be good to incentivize people to register an ADU as a rental property under the subsidized housing inventory for Newburyport, because it would only help us toward achieving that 10% minimum threshold to be in safe harbor. So I promise there's 3 more slides. There's still lots more words, but moving through those, I will defer to Director Port to chime in on the next couple. This gets into a bit of the weeds of zoning, but first we're on actually, Director Port, can you flip back to slide 3? Thank you. So on the left here, there's an image. If you're not familiar with ADUs, I just want to sort of, for the next couple of slides, these are the types of ADUs. So working from right to left, we have an upper level unit. On the bottom, you see a garage conversion unit. In the middle, you've got an above garage unit or an attached unit that sort of looks like the garage. On the bottom left, you have a lower unit, so a garden level. And then in the top left is a detached unit. And so we'll have a little bit of a different treatment for all of the above, except for the top left with the detached unit that we'll walk through in these next slides. Thank you, Director Ford. So the standards that we'll walk through first are for all of them except for a detached unit, well, including a detached unit. And then we'll have additional standards for detached units. So these are for a non-conforming structure, meaning expansions may be allowed to add an ADU if they meet the dimensional controls of the relevant zoning district. If expanding a non-conformity, then the special permit for non-conformities is sought. If adding another non-conformity, then a variance must be sought. So essentially, if you have a non-conforming structure, which we do a lot in Newburyport, you can include an ADU in your structure with a special permit for nonconformities if you're not going beyond your existing nonconformity. If you do extend further into a more nonconforming space, then that would require a variance. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Great.
Yes. Yep.
Permitted in law apartments, this one's a little bit easier. If you have one of those 7, you can convert it by a zoning review and determination from the zoning administrator. The Plum Island Overlay District remains in effect as it applies to ADUs following limitations in section 21G, getting really good at Roman numerals. And then for short-term rentals, as we've covered, but I think it's worth reiterating, any ADU converted or created after the final date of adoption shall be prohibited from being rented as a short-term rental, nor can they be split up to be sold as condominiums. So if you're adding one of these to your property remains a single family. You cannot sell your ADU as a separate piece. You can't split the lot, and you certainly can't, we're advising that you not be able to run it as a short-term rental. These are for, for additional rental units. And the final thing on this slide is applicability to detached ADUs. So all of these standards will apply. And the next slide, as I mentioned, is these are additional standards we're applying to those detached units. So placement of a detached ADU, the planning board through special permit may reduce the required side or rear yard setbacks upon a finding that the granting of such relief will be consistent with the intent of this ordinance. So we'll talk about what site plan review includes, but we're advising that detached ADUs go before the planning board for that process. And if you are looking for a reduced setback, that's when you would be able to receive that approval potentially. The total allowed ADUs on site, as we talked about, we're proposing for one detached ADU to be allowed as of right as an accessory unit where the structure is compliant with dimensional controls and other provisions of the Newburyport zoning ordinance. And then permitting permitting for non-conforming detached accessory structures. So conversion or extension of it, this one gets a little complicated. Conversion or extension of an existing accessory structure. So if you have a garage or a shed in your backyard, that is dimensionally non-conforming for use as an ADU. So you could have a garage that's fine as a garage, but if you want to turn it into an ADU, it gets out of the compliance with the zoning. I'm looking at Jennifer, hoping I'm getting this right. So this would allow for you to go through and receive a special permit for nonconformities to convert that. And then any newly created dimensional nonconformities would require variance from the ZBA per usual. Anything else to add, Director Ford?
No, that's a great summary, actually. Two things I guess I just wanted to speak to briefly, just to clarify a little further for folks who may not necessarily understand. The Plum Island Overlay District has a restriction relative to the number of new bedrooms that can be added. This is part of the limitation of growth on the island based on the infrastructure that was put out there, right? So this is part of the history back there. The clarification here is that that is not changed by the allowance of accessory dwelling units. That is still something that we have to adhere to. There are actually other state levels of regulation that are enforcing that. So this is just clarifying that. The other one I thought was just more of a general statement was, as Councilor Harmon was saying, and I think Councilor Khan spoke to a little bit earlier, these types of accessory dwelling units that are freestanding structures will be much harder to do in a tighter area of the city. So these things are not subject to the lighter standards of setback of what we call accessory structures, like a tiny little shed or something that could be closer to a property line. These are subject to the primary structure setbacks. So there are already the normal setbacks being required in the placement of a structure like this. And as Councilor Harmon pointed out, deviations from the zoning, just like any other spatial deviation from zoning, would be subject to a board review. The level of modification they're looking for, if it's happening, may require a special permit, or if they want something as a further deviation, that would be a variance, and that is a harder level to get. So the point being that in tighter areas of the city where there's concern about setbacks and spatial relationships, those will be subject to a board review.
One more slide.
That's fine. We've almost made it. So these are the details of site plan review for detached ADUs. So our proposal has all ADUs going through a minor site plan review by the planning board in consideration of these proposed criteria. I will not read all of them to you, as I think that this will be part of the conversation. But a few things to call out. The exterior design should be compatible with the existing residential structure. We provide an example of that. Enclosing stairways within exterior walls, providing adequate open space and landscaping. Also, the detached ADU will maintain a compatible relationship to adjacent lots and will not significantly impair the privacy of abutting residents. And the detached ADU will not result in excessive noise, traffic, or parking congestion. So these are some of the protections and process that we're proposing to impose on a detached unit. And so I'll wrap up with just thanks to all who have contributed to this proposal, and we look forward to the feedback and deliberation of the planning board, planning and development committee to make this the best zoning possible.
Thank you. I think now we're going to have Attorney North speak.
Attorney Norton?
Yes, good evening. Thank you. Apologize for not being able to be there in person tonight. I provided some review of the proposed zoning and looked at some of the questions that were provided, and just want to hit a couple of the highlights from my review with respect to this particular zoning. First thing is, as we know, and has been explained, that these in a single family residential zoning district, a single ADU that is accessory to the principal residential structure has to be allowed as of right. And again, that applies whether the ADU is wholly contained within the structure or is a conversion of an existing structure. And so the permitting process would kick in, as you heard previously, as to whether or not whether the new structure or the conversion structure is non-conforming or creates a non-conformity. So essentially, as long as the ADU fits within the allowed build box, under the dimensional requirements on that lot per current zoning on that lot, then there's no additional permitting that's required. To the extent that site plan requirements are imposed, it's very important that we understand that site plan is a creature of, I'm sorry, was there a question?
No, thank you.
Okay,
Please
all right.
proceed. Thank you.
It's important that we all understand that site plan review is a creature of case law, not statute, as of yet anyway. And when you are imposing site plan review requirements, they have to be limited to objective standards and not discretionary standards. So for example, in the proposed zoning and in that last slide that Councilor Harmon just discussed, there are some items in those slides, some language that I have some concerns about. The use of the word compatible, the use of the word adequate, the use of the word useful, and the use of the word significantly impair. Those are all subjective standards. They are not objective standards. And I think that they're going to be difficult to apply. And I think that when you have those standards in a public discussion, in a public meeting, you potentially can run afoul of the strictures on site plan review. In his 927 memo, Director Port and his staff put together some kinds of examples of objective standards that are, related to site plan review. The other thing that's important to understand, and some examples of those more objective kind of reviews, are the type of review that is allowed for Dover protected uses. And the Dover protected uses are in Section 3 of Chapter 40A, which, not surprisingly, is where the legislature put the provisions on the ADUs. So I think you have to look at the ADUs as a type of protected use. Clearly it is when it's as of right. And I think that you have to consider that the type of regulation that is allowed that includes site plan review is limited to bulk and height of the structures, lot size, yard size, setbacks, open space, parking, and building coverage. And those are the types of restrictions that are, determined already by the courts to be objective and fit within the standard of site plan review. So those are my comments for the moment, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do any members of the council or the planning board have any questions for Attorney Norton? I have two questions. The first question, and it may be just a clarifying question rather than a question, a substantive question. You mentioned that the ADU must be accessory to the principal residential structure. Now, given that the interpretation is that the single residence district is a district that allows single residence, it's not a district that is restricted to single residences. So many of the existing residential structures will be 2 families and 3 families and 4 families. So I would interpret what you're saying as meaning that any of those types of residential structures, which are principal dwellings, would qualify to have a single accessory dwelling unit added to them on the same lot. Is that correct?
No, it has to be a single family. It has to be a single family structure, not a multiple dwelling.
So,
no multiple
so why
family
do you
dwelling.
say that? Because the word dwelling includes multiple units.
Yep.
And a dwelling has dwelling units within it, according to our ordinance. So that's what's confusing me.
I'm sorry, Rick, are you also referring to in the statute where it refers to in a single family zoning district?
No,
Okay, not with respect to that phrasing.
no.
No, it's under the definition that self-contained housing unit.
Yep.
Sorry. I think we're referring to the definition where ADU is defined as a self-contained housing unit,
Yep.
inclusive of cooking, sleeping, sanitary facilities on the same lot as principal dwelling,
Yep.
subject to applicable dimensional and parking requirements. I think that's what we're referring to.
Yeah, no, I understand. And I think you have to read that definition also in the context of the actual regulation in section 8 of the law. Which talks about the land and structures for single accessory dwelling use or the rental of such in a single family residential zoning district, provided that the use of land or structures for such accessory dwelling shall be subject to reasonable regulations. Should not require, it talks about the principal dwelling. And I understand that a principal dwelling is a self-contained housing unit and could contain multiple dwelling units. But I do not see that this applies to anything other than single family homes.
I would appreciate it perhaps if you could take a careful look at that and get back to us on that, because that seems to be contrary to the way we would normally interpret our zoning ordinance. But I'll just leave that there for now. My second question is, toward the end of the same paragraph, you say, so long as the ADU fits in with the allowed build box, no permitting can or should be required. And my question would be, there's a difference, I think, between an attached ADU and a detached ADU. If you were proposing to build a new detached ADU on a lot that was, say, half the size of the minimum required lot area for the zoning district, would that be allowed as of right, or would that require a variance because you're adding a new non-conformity in the sense of a new building, a non-conforming lot?
Yeah, so
If I may, I would interpret it as the latter. That you're subject to the board review.
Yeah, so I was asking, yeah. So do you understand my question?
yeah, could you, sorry, you cut out a little bit at the end. Would you repeat the question again, please?
So, well, in very simple terms, if the existing lot with the existing principal dwelling on it does not meet minimum lot area and frontage requirements, can a new residential structure that is an attached ADU be added to it as of right? Or does that need to have a variance?
It doesn't fit within the build box, so it's going to need a variance.
Well, I guess that's what I was wondering what you meant by build box. I can see build box as meaning the setbacks. You're saying the build box also includes the minimum lot area?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, all right. Councilor Z.
Can I use this one? Is that all right? Just to see.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have so many, but I'm just gonna try. So I'm trying to understand things just to wrap my head around it. So some mention was talking by the director of this in already dense areas. So my question is, can you slow down just a little bit for me and talk about how we don't get infill, undesirable infill with this? Because first thing, okay, let me start here. I want to second the planning board chair's question, because I have the same exact question. If you have an existing two-family, when I read it to me, you could add 900 square foot piece. So I'm very much would like to know that. So the second question though is, being on the council for a while, as many of us have been, infill was a huge challenge and people filling into lots and so forth. So how do the sponsors or whomever wants to answer think there are protections in here to inhibit sort of that infill? That'd be okay.
Did you want to?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, excellent question. I think we all definitely know infill is a bad word and we all ran, that's like a cuss word. But I think for me, a few things, which is why I spent time on the in-law apartment, because I wanted to kind of give some context of what we already kind of have in our zoning. A zoning that allowed some type of an accessory dwelling, granted it was limited for family members. We don't really know actually, we know that there's attached garages that have housing above, we walk by them. Are they in-laws? We don't know. But to me, what I think is a significant piece of what we have by just looking, and if we go to our a couple of things, the dimensional requirements table, as well as our, dimensional requirements would be great. So one of the dimensional requirements,
Oh, sorry.
one of the things that at least gives me some interesting kind of peace of mind is in the concept of what are the requirements and what is triggering any additional development requirements. And it is the primary dwelling, as we talked about. So the single family home. So when we talk about the setbacks, we talk about the clearances, it's not like they're gonna get waived to do something else or create a bigger percentage of that lot. Like think of a single family lot, and I walked through the south end a little bit. Oh yeah, slide 14. I walked around the south end and you look and see what could be split into different sizes to do what you're talking about. And we've seen that a lot becoming two big homes. I think what limits it is one, the maximum size of the square footage is one area where it's the lesser of 900 square feet or whatever the gross square feet is of the home, half of that. The other thing though is it has to meet that dimensional requirements for the primary dwelling, which is not what the case was for a lot of the infill homes that we saw populate and sprinkled throughout the city. That's one area. I'm not saying it's the full answer, but that's something where it will require variances, special permits, if they were to go beyond that.
I'll just add, I think we've tried to adhere to the by right spirit of the state law for all of the ADU types outside of detached. And then part of that is, we're imposing site plan review to provide public opportunity for neighbors and abutters potentially to participate if there is a detached unit.
So it kind of leads into my second question, well, which is, so in the case of a variance for the dimensional controls, is the standard substantially not more detrimental? Is that the standard that's utilized to grant a variance against the dimensional controls?
That's essentially in substance, one of the criteria that the board is looking at, but the most important piece there is that they have to have a hardship in order to be eligible essentially for the granting of a variance. It's a much higher level of demonstrated hardship that's unique to this particular property as compared to say the rest of the neighborhood in some way, and unique to the property, not to the individual.
And the variance would be the ZBA.
The zoning board of appeals, correct?
Even though the planning board is acting in a larger role.
Correct, because we cannot assign the variances to the planning board.
All right, I just want to keep moving, so I don't want to take up everybody's time, but my next question is, staying on the variance topic, there was no specific language about inhibiting variances on parking requirements. Is that something that was considered? So in other words, you're requiring the one, but it sounds like we're going to waive the requirement for one. Forget about the exception you created. Is that something that was considered?
No, it was not. And I think part of it with the state requirement of having, must not exceed one parking requirement in terms of exploring ways to get around that aspect of parking considerations, we didn't really address, but I would be curious in terms of what are some other kind of, I would say, tools we could apply in the zoning that would give some, address that issue. And that could be a great amendment. We are taking notes based on the conversation, and we definitely heard Attorney Nord's comments too on our words. So the sponsor and I are working together. So these are things we can
Something you
explore.
could consider it in.
Yeah.
Prohibition on variances on parking. We've done that in other cases. It actually leads, again, these are leading well, which is good for me. So my next question is about a couple of the requirements that could change after the structure is created. So for example, the parking can be waived if you're on the SHI, but then what happens if you're no longer on the SHI at some point? For example, you do a 30-year deed restriction, or you choose to no longer offer it as a rental. And now you come out of compliance with SHI, but you got to build a unit predicated on that without parking.
If I may, it would then become non-conforming, it would be ineligible to be used as an accessory dwelling unit at that point. just from a legal nature, that's what would happen. They would be non-compliant with the requirements of the ordinance or the permit
And
involved.
same thing for, let's say you build a new one and you consume parking that you were utilizing towards your principal structure to meet its either non-conformity or conformity. So let's say garage was mentioned a couple of times. I know garage spaces are not necessarily most counted as garage, but let's say you consume the driveway space to construct your, now everything. The original structure now has a problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I follow. I think the way that I would respond to that is just in essence that you cannot essentially you can't double dip, right? So you have to provide parking for each use independently. So the parking space for the accessory dwelling unit would not be able to overlap with the parking spaces that the zoning administrator would have to verify around the property for the underlying primary residential use. So from looking at the site plan, essentially, we would have to see that there are the requisite number of spaces in total, and that there's not sort of double dipping.
All the uses.
All the uses are in total, correct? Yeah.
That's right. And I would agree with that as well.
Last couple questions are the 0.5 waiver for parking. I think the interesting area about that is around the garage, which was specifically annotated here. That's the densest part of the city, and I was wondering, is the 0.5 mandated by the state? That's a state mandate?
It
Yes.
is mandated, and I've mapped it out, so it actually goes down basically to Bromfield Street in the south end, and as far as Dove Street in the north end. So it actually covers the densest part of the city, and that's mandated by the state that you can't require parking there.
All right, last one or two is the two, I was confused by the two structures per lot line, because that seems to be more expansive than just ADUs. It just seems to be a bigger statement. And I know we just had this debate during the R3 mobile station change where we allowed more than one structure. Going backwards, you have 6C and a few other. So, to be expansive in its nature.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I apologize that none of us spoke to it, but I probably should have spoken to it earlier. So just in summary, this is actually, I think, a recommendation more so from the Office of Planning and Development, just something that we thought was at least reasonably worthy of consideration, simultaneous or with the discussion of accessory dwelling units. It is something that, to your point, I guess the assumption here is that it applies to other scenarios where there might be accessory structures. But I think what we thought might be reasonable is, given we sometimes have these discussions about, clutter or how many structures are being added and so forth, those can become sensitive, considerations. That provision is not necessary for this structure, so to speak, and it does go and address other types of, accumulation of structures on a given property. But if there's any sort of sensitivity, in a neighborhood or, for butters in terms of how many structures are going to be plopped down on different properties, aside from the fact that they all have to comply with, setbacks, we thought it was at least reasonable to consider perhaps there's a cap on how many you can keep adding to beyond your primary structure, how many more accessory structures you can add to a given lot. That is, and again, that is not something that's necessary for the ADU piece per se, but we thought it was at least worthy of consideration simultaneously, given that discussion of ADUs involves, in some cases, a potentially accessory structure.
Yeah, I'm sure people don't want to hear me say the same thing I said during the previous iteration of this debate, but the one lot, one structure was sort of always a very straightforward thing, and this combined with the prior one, so maybe that's better for deliberation. I'll yield for now. Thank you for.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Yes, Councilor Wright.
So I think I'd like to try and understand this in layman's terms without all of the jargon that goes with planning. So if you want to have an ADU that is a part of an existing building, you can do that by right as long as the property that you are planning to put that on meets all the offsets of the primary or the single family use.
Correct.
Of that building.
Yeah, correct.
Actually,
Dimensional.
yeah. Could I just make a little? Just
Sorry, wait for the mic, sorry.
with the proviso that if the existing building doesn't meet the setbacks and you're not expanding the existing building, you can still put it in there. So the building doesn't actually have to meet all the zoning standards as long as you're not expanding.
Right. Yeah, where it's a pre-existing condition, right?
Yes, so I think I understand that, because most of the lots in Newburyport pre-existing non-conforming, that's why you guys have the problems you have, and the ZBA has the problems they have. So that's understood. So now if you want to do a detached one, then now you're subject to site plan review,
Correct.
if you qualify in all the.
Correct.
And then if you're increasing the non-conformity, then you have to get a variance from the ZBA.
Correct.
Respect.
Well,
Could
no,
I
if-
add- Sorry, I'll
Sorry.
raise my hand. I apologize.
Go ahead, Attorney Nguyen.
I just want to be clear, for the detached ADUs, even though there is site plan review potentially required, they are still allowed as of right. It does not make a difference whether they are attached or detached or within the unit as to the as of right status.
Yes, understood, because that's the law.
Okay, great.
Jennifer Blanchet, zoning administrator. I did want to clarify another point to your question. If a unit is proposed within an existing dwelling, conforming to setbacks or not conforming to setbacks, it still has to be reviewed as compliant with parking. So in these dense neighborhoods that are outside of that 1/2 mile radius, they would have to illustrate, in order to create a second unit within, that they have an additional parking space.
Determined by the zoning administrator.
Yes.
Not
And I
the
think-
not the bank.
Correct.
So my question is, how do we ensure that these ADUs are not turned into man caves and shisha?
Sorry, I'm not, maybe you could clarify.
How do we, I mean, if the goal is to create more housing, how do we make sure that they get utilized outside the family? They're not just creating more structure for the existing family.
Well, I mean, you're talking about monitoring constantly the use on any given property, right? So I guess we're talking about the authorization in essence of the use there, but chasing sort of what's happening after that, whether or not it's being used by the primary homeowner as sort of an accessory structure. Obviously, these are things that might be triggering some, oversight or some review by the city at some point, or some issues been raised, but the question of what we can't, I guess the question of sort of penalizing someone because they're not using it as the accessory dwelling unit they're eligible to under zoning or the statute. I'm not sure that we can mandate, that's a little bit more tricky to accomplish from a legal perspective. I would defer to Karis, but I think that would be difficult.
I'll just add, Dave, if we're trying to help create more housing, but if housing could also be for a child or a parent, just sort of the in-law model. So while that wouldn't necessarily generate rental income for the homeowner, it would still be net new housing for a unit, or for them to have at their disposal, so that they have two places to live.
Just a question, how do you monitor whether the SHI is, if they did do that each year?
Sure. Actually, getting a unit on the subsidized housing inventory is actually a relatively involved process. There's actually a deed restriction that has to be done on the property. There's a state monitoring process and so forth. So it's actually I think a current discussion the state officials are having and local communities are having, because while I definitely support the provision of the ordinance that would accomplish getting some of these units added to the subsidized housing inventory, unfortunately, that process is a little bit onerous. So in terms of paperwork, but the result is that there's a deed restriction on the property that is enforceable, and this goes back to the city, but also goes back to the state, so in state regulations. So in essence, it is added to an inventory, the city is monitoring, the state's monitoring, and there's a legal requirement that's reported in the registry, a deed writer that makes it a requirement that it be rented, essentially that affordable rate.
Yeah, I had a question on that subsidized housing inventory. Well, and so you mentioned the deed restriction, and could you just go over the other requirements in order to get it on that?
Oh, sure. Sorry, the one that, probably the substantive one that I didn't speak to is more about so it's the fair marketing or, eligibility for folks coming into the units. That's something that we had in there is that, essentially what's absorbed by that is essentially that you cannot discriminate in your process for those, anybody who's essentially eligible for the unit based on their income threshold, right, or the eligibility for the rental status. You cannot, pick one subclass and say, and this goes back to other sort of case law, and things like that. So, but in essence, it's fair marketing. I think that it's to add to the fact that the deed restriction calls for that affordable, threshold for rentals. So, it's the marketing of the. It's the end. There is a process in which, there's someone who's running the lottery, that's typically done by a consultant or somebody who's familiar with the process. So there'd be a lottery that is done by that person because they're familiar with the state process. And they're following those procedures so that it can be fairly, basically, hopefully, sort of made available for folks, at least in terms of their interests. So those are, I guess, in summary, would that be kind of the substance.
Thank you. Second question, just to clarify the idea of the maximum of 2 accessory structures on a lot. You mentioned garages and sheds. Are there other things that fall into that category, just so we're clear? And does that mean if there is a garage and a shed already on the property, then they're restricted from doing an ADU?
Or detached.
Oh, okay, that's.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. In essence, they have to choose at that point, that they want to remove a structure and see if that would, if the new thing is being compliant. But in essence, yes, they would be limited by, they would not be able to add that additional structure without addressing the dimensional. And again, this goes back to something we talked about earlier, which is essentially all the dimensional and, spatial constraints are still applicable. Those do not change. They don't go away just because there's an allowance of an accessory dwelling unit, that's been authorized here by the statute. Those spatial relationships are still, applicable in communities and in the zoning.
And are there other structures that fall into that category, say a covered patio or other than a shed or?
There are some things that, you started getting a covered, you're triggering that threshold, basically, like, are you putting a cover on it, you putting walls, right? You're then going into a structure that's regulated by that. There are some things that sort of below deck, for instance, sort of the ground that wouldn't be considered a structure. Obviously with the burglars administrator, but in general, basically, you go into that threshold where you're adding a roof, you put walls, it's a structure and you're subject to those setbacks. And so that would not be something that you could do unless you brought into compliance with setbacks. And that's to, in fairness to neighbors, they would see that as a spatial impact.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's been brought up, I think, from Councilor Zede as well, but I will say that was actually, it's not something that came from us as sponsors. It was something coming more from the planning department, or more, I think, from, and this is where, I'm open to what folks think about it. But if we think of communities or areas, like if you looked at R1 and where it's mainly located, we think Ward 5, 6, large property, residential, yards where a lot of this can really proliferate, I should say, or happen. And I think the intention on creating some limit, that was the intention, I think. How could we, maybe solve a problem if it may become one? But if we just limit it to one, accessory structure, like why even put a number, right? Just be agnostic on it. And, just do the ADU ordinance, don't say anything about limitations on accessory structures. I think this was an attempt to not get a proliferation within neighborhoods of maybe several accessory items. So I'm open to what my colleagues, what folks think would be best for our community. And, but that was not something that came from us as sponsors really needing to put it. I think Heather had a question.
I have a question about when you said that if they wanted to go into FHI, it would become a deed restriction. If somebody went through that process and was living with that ADU in that program, but then decided down the road they're going to sell the property as a whole, can the deed go back to conventional deed, or is it remain restricted?
At the same time, it would still be subject to that restriction for the life of that, restriction. So your restriction is going to be something that, for 30 years, and you basically talking to the state, that would be difficult to do. The whole point is to keep them in that restricted to that provision. So there'd be something to the same. Yeah.
I'd like to thank the council for taking quick action and the sponsors in particular so that we can benefit from this really important initiative at the Commonwealth. I just have two questions. The first is, I think it'd be great following up on Councilor Wright's questions about just to really get this out in the open, what's allowed in kind of layman's terms. I'd like for the sponsor, someone perhaps the planner, the town planner, city planner to address the not uncommon situation where there's a structure that's mostly conforming in almost every way, but there's insufficient frontage or perhaps the lot's a little bit too small. So it'd be great to have crystal clarity on that scenario. And then the other question is, and I had this thought when I read it the first time, and I think the city's attorney is gone even further, but it seemed a little bit restricted to me with existing structures, existing tax structures to require the level of permitting that you put into the ordinance. Have you considered relaxing that? And in particular, now that we have the city attorney's comments, applying some, I think also the city staff's report had these comments as well, having more objective standards as discussed.
So I'll just answer the first question on route. I think, in essence, to answer your first question, they would be subject to board review, special permit non-conformities, right? Or depending if they're going to go further with the variance, it's going to be a board review. The butter input is a hearing.
Yeah, no, good questions. I think, one of the things that the sponsor and I are trying to balance though, is the state has come out with some very, you could call somewhat prescriptive regulations, and then some other, what I call guidance. One of the things and the reason I wanted to show the table of use is to say, look at Newburyport, look at our kind of how single family homes are around the city, around the community. Look at where we may have just really seen a concentration of single family homes. Look where we have multifamily homes and even lodging houses, elderly housing. This is our snapshot. This is our local context. So as we are trying to do what I think is smart legislation, allowing where we can, where the state is very clear, where could we provide additional kind of guidance or I would say points to look and see where does this really make sense where it's going? And I would say with the site plan review on detached, because really the in-law apartments were only allowed on an attached home. It was never talking about dwelling being a detached use on a property. So for me, I definitely heard the Attorney North on some of the language. I wrote down the words that were kind of, I guess, subjective. And I think that there is, I think, a place we can land where we could accomplish that. So the sponsor and I are definitely going to be writing up some additional language. We got some ideas from the planning department. I really do want to give a shout out to Director Port and to the zoning administrator officer, Jennifer Blanchett, because it was nice to talk to them about the people who are actually trying to execute the legislation we write, the bylaws we write. But that's where I do want to see some, I guess I would say, thoughtful legislation, knowing that those aspects are critical to how we really are, our local context, our neighborhood. Did I answer? Was that all your questions? I can't remember what the other.
Could you bring up the zoning map? So, Plum Island's off the charts. Can't do anything there. Unless you have one bedroom and you're adding a second bedroom.
Yeah, I mean, just summarize real briefly, and Jennifer, can correct if she has any disagreement, but I think in summary, it would not be technically infeasible, but it'd be very practical purposes the most infeasible because you'd have to work within the existing structure. You'd have very little option.
And then moving from right to left, most of Joppa and Ward 1, parts of Ward 2 would be challenged to provide parking in that area. And so this really is something that would lend itself towards the areas that you've already identified, which is the single family zoning areas and single families in other zoning that meet the requirements. Park. And then the downtown area is exempt from the park, but there isn't a lot of space or an additional structure on those properties. Is that a good summation? a very fair assessment, yes.
And I do want to go on. I do want to add something too. So as you saw, in-law apartment, 1989. A lot has happened in the Commonwealth since then. So a lot of communities, I think there's been a report on that, like 137 communities, when they looked outside the Boston area, have already updated their in-law apartment ordinances to put some type of ADU, even before the state legislation. And there's a great paper that actually talks about, based on the size of the community, many of them are constrained by aspects, if it's by right, and you have dimensional requirements. Some of them actually just have it by special permit, some by right, and the ones that by right, even then, the number of units you're getting annually can vary from 2 to 8 a year. So it's not like there's a large amount that are really going to be generated, but there's enough that are slowly kind of, if it makes sense, will happen. But it's not at this high rate that some people think might be happening. And I could send the paper around. There was a couple more recent papers that had some good data across the Commonwealth on what really has been happening with legislation, that bylaws that communities already have in place.
Are there more questions?
Thank you. Yeah. I guess I just am concerned about the interplay with our high street overlay districts and this ordinance, and trying to grapple with, are we defeating anything that we were trying to do with those overlay districts? Does this open up concerns for those districts as far as putting additional building residential space in some of those open areas?
Well, I was not the original author of the zoning change itself, so I wouldn't, speak for those ones, but I do think, based in general context, and say from a land use, it would not be actually surprising in some ways when, if you're looking at it, there are larger structures, right? So breaking an existing structure and then having an accessory dwelling unit within it, for instance, wouldn't necessarily be, again, a lot of those properties do have a big extensive driveway, right? Parking, things like that, right? And in a lot of cases, we have carriage houses, we have accessory structures there already. In some cases, we want to preserve those accessory structures. There are a few that we can think of that are, off the street right now, that have accessory structures. They might be older, and we actually want to see them preserved. And one way to renovate them and keep them preserved and active as part of that historic character is to allow them as accessory dwelling. And so I'm not convinced that there's anything inconsistent. And to me, that's very consistent with, what you might see. And it doesn't necessarily create any additional issues, per se, in any way different than any other context. In some cases, those lots are able to absorb or deal with a situation like that in a much better way, because there is space to do things like that, whether it's within the existing structure or on the larger parcel. At least that's the I'm seeing there.
Yeah, I guess just the one concern was, as far as several ones on High Street with the large open space in front, and given that amount of space, they still could have additional buildings potentially in front, and still satisfy the open space requirement potentially. I'm not sure, just trying to grapple with that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't done like a lot by lot analysis. I can almost guarantee you, if the zoning administrator took a look at these, all the different constraints, the front setback, right? There's substantial in the high street district compared to others. Those dimension requirements essentially are gonna have, and not to mention the consideration for not putting the accessory dwelling unit right, beautiful. It's unlikely to be a choice when there's land probably on the back or the offset, typically. I think it'd be a but do that.
See this?
There is actually a current prohibition for accessory structures, which these would be in front yard setback. So unless there was a structure there that is so far set back, and we could look at this in detail and perhaps address that. But I think it's highly unlikely, but it's a good point.
Are there any more questions?
No, I'd be fine.
So, if there are no other questions, we probably should open this up on it.
Can I just say?
Yeah, go ahead.
And before we start public comment, just to clarify that this is not a back and forth question and answer type of thing. You can ask a question, but we won't be answering it tonight. And please limit your time to perhaps 3 minutes so everybody has a chance to speak. And if you want to participate, ask a question, make a comment, please come to the podium.
Hi, good evening. Judy Timon, 39 Lime Street. The first thing I want to do is to thank the members of the City Council, Councilor Khan and Councilor Harmon for so quickly acting on this and bringing it forward. And also for taking into account the concerns of the Housing Coalition. I thank you for that. And I just ask you, as you continue to discuss this provision and this ordinance, that you keep in mind the intent of the state statute, which was to make this process as convenient and accessible to residents to create an accessory dwelling unit. You know, I think as also Councilor Khan mentioned at the very beginning of her remarks, you know, local context is very important. And the local context is that we are losing rental units at a very, very rapid rate. And we are in dire need of housing. And this is one of the ways that we can add to our housing stock. Again, I thank you.
Stephanie Nakatich, 93 High Street. Just as a first point, if you're going to publish your slides, I think you need to look at the use matrix again, because I think all of the both of the STRU uses are not properly marked in terms of what's permitted. So please check that out. Keep it using. That's part of my. So for nearly a decade, the city has been talking about replacing our in-law ordinance with an accessory dwelling unit ordinance. All in-law apartments require a special permit with public notice and need to be renewed. The process not always followed, and this is not helpful for long-term housing and diversity. I support the ADU ordinance proposed, including its requirement for public notice and site plan review for, at the very least, detached ADU. I have a question and a concern. Both the proposed ADU ordinance and our existing STRU ordinance do not allow ADUs to become short-term rentals. Obviously, if ADUs simply become Airbnbs, their purpose as long-term housing solution is completely wrong and would violate the Affordable Homes Act. The STRU ordinance has been in place now for nearly a year. I have asked the planning office multiple times without clear reply. Are we monitoring short-term rental uses now that we have that ordinance? Because without monitoring, there is no enforcement. When will we have monitoring of short-term rentals so that both the STRU ordinance and the upcoming ADU restrictions can be enforced?
That's Chuck, 144 Mill Street. Back in November, I came into this room and for the big meeting for housing production and community to talk about the development of more housing in the city. And I sat at a table of people interested in discussing ADUs, one of the groups that I was with, and every single person at this table, which was very crowded, we were squeezed in around it, was very excited about the idea that we could have ADUs. Why don't we have these and why can't we do it? There was one older woman was so excited about the idea, like, if I could have one that was ground level and I could wheel in and I could stay here, but like, how come we can't build this? And everybody described this. The phrase low hanging fruit is what kept coming up. This is something that homeowners can do for short money, if they are lucky, short money, or a bigger investment if it's gonna be a struggle. But this is something that we can do bit by bit, piece by piece, and we're not relying on developers to control all of our, all of our housing needs. This is something we can do for ourselves, we can do for our neighbors and with them. So I'm really excited that this is finally happening. And I hope that you all, can really come to agreement. I appreciate how thoughtful this is. And I will say, the one person at that round table, the one concern that came up was short-term rental units, as we just heard. I am satisfied that I heard in here that that's off the table. So whatever you have to do to strengthen that language to make everybody feel good about this makes perfect sense to me. But I'm really excited to see this go through, and I'm gonna be following it. So you're gonna have more meetings. You will see me here. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Jay. I'm a resident at 83 High Street. I'm just speaking for myself. Some things that I in mind. First, it seems like it'll be important for you to make it clear what the accessory dwelling unit is accessory to. As I understood Kara's form, the city solicitor, her understanding is the mandate from the state is that only for single family homes. But it is true, Tanner said, that we have a lot of other kinds of dwellings in Newburyport. So I guess it would be important for the city council to specify, would it be, you can only have these accessory to a single family home or a single two family or whatever, just, we know the mandate from the state is for single family districts. But you can do more. You. I mean, for example, you probably wouldn't want to have an accessory to a 50-unit apartment. That seems a little odd. The next point is this language, single family zoning district. Break the chair, that means that it doesn't actually mean single family zoning district, but it means anywhere, any district where single family homes are allowed. And I wasn't familiar with that. I did look in chapter 48 and I didn't see that definition. And I understood that the state mandate was for just our single family district. We do have a single family district, as Councilor Khan said. But our in-laws are allowed much more broadly than that. The report is so appropriate not to just limit it to our single family district. So I applaud the councilors for making it broader. Just want to be careful about what the state is requiring and doing, which is more. On the same note, I was surprised by Rick's comment saying that for sure the parking garage at Titcomb Street is a bus station. Again, there's no definition in the statute. The regulations aren't out yet. And we certainly shouldn't wait because you only have until February 2nd. There's a website that's up, local communities, executive office, pretty much on. And I'm working on it, catch up. But it's a little confusing. The phrasing of a commuter rail stop, a ferry stop, so on. It's the same language they have in the MBTA communities law, but that's for MBTA service. Whereas we have other services through the MVRTA. Now, again, on a policy basis, you can plant your flag where you want. If you want to exempt ADUs within half a mile of Titcomb Street Garage, you can do that. But I haven't seen any state ruling that that station is a quote bus station under the definition. For example, my understanding is MVRTA doesn't actually stop there. They do stop at the CVS on Pond Street. They do stop on Story Avenue.
those bus stations, where you also have to waive the parking, you should probably pin that down. Also, I'm afraid I have to defer from your lawyer. If you look at the language of the statute, it says, subject to reasonable regulations and guidance. And then there's a comma, and it says, including but not limited to, it gives a bunch of examples of what you can do. And respectfully, I think the advice you're getting is a little too conservative, because they give, it's not exclusive. And they give a different phrasing. They say site plan review, comma, regulations concerning dimensional site plans and bulk and height of structures. All of those are in play. So I may have misheard, but I thought what was being implied by the city solicitor is that if you do site plan review, you can only do dimensional setbacks. I think that's what the legislature wrote. The legislature understands what site plan review is. And that's why, as she told you, it's from case law. It's 50 years of case law. That gets to my next point, which is that I didn't hear. And, you know, in Newburyport, that is important, aesthetics, especially because it's Councilor Condon. Under our in-law, there was never any detached in-law. So what we have is a new animal. We have a detached ADU. And personally, I think in order to keep peace in neighborhoods, you should have a board review through site plan review, the details of an individual building, not just have staff mechanically apply conventional. That's not site plan review, that's just zoning review. That's something that Jed Marche does anyway. So that's different. I heard the Attorney North mention this new ADU requirement is put in section 3 over amendment things, which is the sort of thou shalt not section of the zoning act. But there are 10 other paragraphs. This is the 11th paragraph. Some of them actually do mention aesthetics. The last paragraph, 10, for example, says for antennas, one of your reasonable regulations you can do is aesthetics. So I would have you look closely at that. I think that's relevant. And there is a movement stalling that we should be focusing in the US on zoning for form use. That's really what people care about. Is form. And if you ignore aesthetics, I think you're standing that on its head. Also, I would work closely with your attorney, Ms. Norm, on the language of the site. Absolutely you should. But I think you'll find, and she'll find, in the case law, there has to be some, what we would call subjective language. Words like adequate and so on are upheld in case law. What matters is that the condition is reasonable. You can't do something that's going to essentially de facto ban the use. And for example, there's a very good case, which is part of the basis of our downtown overlay district. That even though, say, a setback would be 8 feet, you can require through site plan review 30 feet, if it's reasonable. And it helps in the context. I think you already heard, you're not going to have to worry about people building ADUs in the front of my street because we already have a lot. There may be situations, for example, where you have someone's house, which is lawfully non-conforming, right on the lot line. And so it may be advisable if someone's going to do a detached ADU in their yard, the normal setback be increased. Why? Because there's someone living next door right on the lot line. And, you know, the purpose is for people to live in peace. Doesn't ban the use. It's reasonable. And again, what we're trying to do, I share with the other speakers who said, we're overdue doing this. An ADU is really low hanging fruit. We talked about it years ago. We didn't do it. Now we're going to do it. I think it's good that we're ahead of the game. It was interesting, almost done, Councilor Preston raised, well, how do we know we approve ADU that's really gonna be used? And you can't. I mean, all you can do under the state definition is have sleeping, sanitary, and cooking. And if they have that, you can't force them to rent it, I don't believe. Attorney North can tell you that that is actually the experience in the San Francisco Bay Area. When they started mandating ADUs, what people were doing is they were just keeping the space for themselves. That's true. And there really isn't anything you can do with it. I guess that's all my comments. Again, I hope you do pass this. I do hope you keep site plan review. I don't think it's onerous. I don't think it contradicts what the state said. They mentioned site plan review specifically. They know what that means.
Owen Smith, 125 Story. Just to touch on the site plan review versus objective nature that we would be evaluating this. Just me thinking long term, having this set of ground rules that people understand going in, protects us against litigation. I'm sure a lot of you are aware we did lose the Supreme Court, where the reasonable interpretation of the regulator isn't going to be deferred to anymore. Thinking long term in the Commonwealth here, we have changes in case law. Would it be better to go up and let the public know what the expectation is to try to keep a lot of this discretionary stuff?
Yes.
Marion BC, 10 Kent Street. When I appreciate all the work that you put into this because I think it's very important. And I like to think about the individuals this could impact. And I think particularly young adults who are starting out in their housing journey who need an option that studio apartment, which is very important to have in robust housing situations. And the other thing I think about is all of our seniors who have had to, or that had to leave the city because they want to downsize. There's no place to downsize. So I think both of those things are really important, and I really support the ordinance and really respect what everybody else has added. So thank you all for your work.
Anybody else for public comment? Is there anybody online? In that case, I'll close the public comment period, but we won't be closing necessarily the public hearing. So if this is continued to a future meeting, then we'll be reopening public comment at that point. So this time, it's time for members of the city council and the planning board to discuss what we've heard and talk about any potential issues or changes.
Thank you. Thank you to the sponsors, first of all. I know this is a pretty quick effort, but it's quite thorough and I appreciate it. I just want to comment after, listening to all the comments and the discussion and, the comments from our attorney. I do feel the site plan review, and as was mentioned, sort of a focus on aesthetics and things like that. I can't help but feel that it's just a little disingenuous to the sort of genesis of the state mandate, the whole spirit of the state mandate, which actually is captured quite well. I just fear that it's, if it's too heavy-handed for certain aspects, it's just going to scare people away. Purpose. So I would just be mindful on how restrictive we do read this.
Otherwise, say.
Anything else?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I'm fairly comfortable with the ordinance, given the dimensional requirements that are still in force and the whole site plan review, so I think that part is good. And I think it's a good thing to go forward with.
So one of the things that I wanted to clarify, because I think I heard some misunderstandings. With this site plan review, it's, the way the ordinance is written, it's a minor site plan review. And so there is not to my understanding, there is not a notification to abutters, there's not a public hearing per se. It would simply be on our agenda as a regular meeting item.
Yes, that's correct. And actually, if I could elaborate to some of the discussion we just heard during public comment and some of the comments that I had made relative to this particular section C of the site plan review. We, the Office of Planning and Development, certainly fully appreciate the need for, design, aesthetics and character and things like that in the community. What I think is a potential issue here is it's more about the method by which the site plan review or the design review process is being done. So I think that the problem here, I guess, what I'm seeing and the potential inconsistency that I'm seeing in both in terms of existing case law, statutory language, as well as evolving case law that will necessarily be coming out of the new statutory language, including such terms as unreasonably regulate and things of that nature. The legislature, again, with rotating members, may have some sense of what site plan review is, but most of that is, as Kara North, I think, indicated earlier, that's indicated by case law. And I think that in essence, to sort of boil it all down, you can have a site plan review and you can run that to a board or you can run it to staff. But if you have to, according to this statutory language here, have objective standards and not subjective ones, this is the problem that the legislature was really trying to address in the first place, which is not having it be unclear whether someone could get to the finish line of creating an accessory dwelling unit. And the difficulty, for instance, with there's two issues potentially here. One is not having objective standards, ones that folks could interpret it differently. Remember, our boards, our zoning board of appeals or planning board, we're 5, 7, or 9 members, all having potentially different interpretations of what consistent with, and so forth is. So, this actually goes back to not just, our own sort of policy level debate, but actually goes back to case law that is not only established, but also will be coming out of this statute. And we will see guidance from the state, and we can, wait for that. I think it was mentioned for public comment, or we can recognize what the statutory language is and what it means in relation to everything else that we've seen in terms of state regulations and case law. And I think that, to circle back on the Rick's question, site plan review here in the ordinance today does not call for a public hearing. One of the concerns that I have, and I think given some of the public comment we heard relative to public hearing or public notice, I think there's a conflation here, a confusion between what a special permit process is and what a site plan review process. For lack of a better term, I'm concerned that some of the language that's used in this section, I think would have to be revised to pass muster courts. It does not use objective standards, it uses subjective standards. And then it assigns that review process to a board of rotating members who, in all fairness, and I respect all the members that both the planning board and the CBA that we work with, but providing no clear guidelines for them as to what makes something compatible, right? And so forth. Language like that can be considered void for vagueness, but the ordinance does not require a public hearing. And so part of my concern there, to circle back on your original question, does it currently require a public hearing or public notice to abutters? No, it does not for a minor site plan review. So where this ordinance amendment is calling for that, and we've heard, for instance, during public comment or otherwise, that this would necessitate public notice and indication to abutters as to what's happening. I don't have an issue with that, just letting you know, that's not the issue. The issue here is it does not call for that in the ordinance. And the unfortunate part is that would confuse folks into thinking that the board could essentially come up with provisions on the fly. We want to change where your window goes. We want to change what kind of landscaping you have here. Some of those things can be reasonable. There's certainly case law to support those types of things, but that can easily go awry, especially when you have many different members all having a different interpretation of what would be acceptable there. So it does not require that notice currently in the ordinance. You could certainly insert that piece in there. We could talk about those components, but I think I would be concerned, to me, it would feel a little bit disingenuous to abutters to suggest that we're giving them notice, they can come to this hearing. But in fairness to the statutory language and what the legislature was intending here, and I think the case law will show, they did not want it to be a discretionary process where the rules are made up on the fly. They want applicants to understand what the rules are from the beginning and be able to proceed to that. So to the extent that things comply with setbacks, and spatial constraints, aesthetics can be applied. They can be applied, and those are important. The question is, how are they being done? Is this actually functioning as a site plan review, or is it functioning more as a discretionary review where the board may not necessarily be able to say no? But when does the design review process end? How do we know between 5, 7, or 9 members when a specific provision is addressed? And that's where I think whatever the revised language is here, I would actually go beyond what Karen North had said earlier. In terms of some of the language cited in here, whatever language might be modified in here, I think we need to take a serious look as to whether that can be reasonably and consistently interpreted by rotating members who may have different interpretations of given phrasing. So whatever that phrasing is there, not just the phrases that Karen North mentioned, I think whatever that revised language is, we need to look at the same type of facets. Is it unclear for someone what those rules are?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think as sponsors, we really understand too, there's not a lot of ordinances that have come out the gate yet to try to meet the state's regulation. A lot of them, like I said, have already existing ADU ordinances, and they're actually the February 2nd, 2025 deadline is actually not a compliance date. It just means something's not enforceable. So we are one of the first to kind of try to come up with something, like I mentioned before, local context. What I think is important for us to know that we at this point are kind of in the driver's seat, or I don't know how to say it, but everything we're doing is, I think, forging a little bit of new space, new ground. And what I would like us to be thoughtful about is what are the tools we could use in our toolbox that can address aspects of, again, the in-law apartment experience, that learnings, to what we know we're going to be trying to bring in, given the state's kind of, like I said, very prescriptive areas. To me, site plan review, as it's written, we understand it needs to be reworked. We want to try to work with what we understand could be some of the language. We want to make it more, I think I've heard the term site plan in terms of a process versus site plan standards. There are things in an ordinance that we could codify, but I think what we have recognized is it does need to be worked. And I really appreciate the public comment. I think we'd like to keep the public hearing open. We are going to come back with revisions. We're going to probably, I also would like to see it streamlined. There is a lot of legalese, repetitive information when I look at it now for the 6th time that I realize it could be a little bit more simpler. So to us, we have our work cut out, and we appreciate all this opportunity, all of your input. Look forward to having more. Email us. But we hope by the next time we come before you, we hope to have something ready to go and with as much feedback as we could take from the community and this hearing here as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And agree with everything my fellow co-sponsor said. I wanted just to chime in response, and also in response to some of the public comment, as well as from my fellow counselors. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that if you go back to the chart in your brains, we have 5 of the 6 types of ADUs, which would not be required to go through a site plan review. So we're talking about one specific example where people would be building a new structure separate from an existing single-family dwelling. So we're not applying this to all, it's applying to one. And as a ward counselor, I appreciate my fellow ward counselor from Ward 1's comments earlier around the community's concerns about infill. And so I think we're attempting to come from a place of creating responsible legislation that doesn't prevent people from creating these detached ADUs, but allows for, in a situation where maybe there isn't a public notice, but there is a public meeting versus some of the alternatives which have been floated around, having the zoning administrator be the the person who in no public space, would be able to determine, some of the allowances for this. So we're starting from a place where we think this, could go best foot forward, but as my co-sponsor, said, we're certainly open to amending the language, taking feedback and making it more specific so that, with any interpretation by any, legal person down the road that we're in compliance with the state law. And that's all. Thank you.
Anything else?
Attorney North, did you want to address? You did raise your hand, I think.
I did, and I lowered it. Thank you.
Okay, no worries.
Could I speak to you?
Yes, let me just, come forward. I just wanted to make sure we clarified a couple of things before the next session of public hearing. And one of them is this question about the meaning of the word dwelling. And it clearly has a meaning in Newburyport zoning, which could be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 20 unit structure. What I hear Attorney North say is that it's clearly intended from her point of view, that the state law meant it as a single family dwelling. And so if that's the case, that opens things up to us. And we can make the decision to change all the words dwelling in this ordinance to the words single family dwelling. If that's what we want to do, or we could keep it or we could keep it more expansive, because if the law requires us to do it for a single family dwelling, we could make the choice to allow it to happen for 2 family or for 3 family dwelling. So I think we just want to make sure we know what we're doing. We write the ordinance and we make that choice. The second thing in terms of a clarification, we've talked a lot about the expansion of the primary dwelling, principal dwelling. We've talked about a detached ADU, but we haven't talked about an existing accessory structure that we then expand. So if we have a 500 square foot garage, could we, under this zoning, turn it into a 900 square foot accessory dwelling? And if that accessory, if that garage were currently non-conforming in terms of setbacks, could that expansion move into the backyard so that the expansion didn't increase the nonconformity? And that could happen by right. So that's kind of an infill question. That issue, the concern about infill, I just want to make sure we understand what's going on there. The third thing in terms of clarification, there was reference made to the city's parking garage as one of the transit stations. That was written into the draft ordinance. That's one of the things where in the draft ordinance says it is understood that this includes. And so that's why when I drew my half-mile boundary, I was just following the proposed zoning ordinance. I would like to understand, I'd like to clarify that, find out whether that's the case. Because that's the third clarification. And then the fourth piece that I'm concerned about, it's not a clarification, I'm just concerned about this idea of shifting the ZBA's responsibility to the planning board in the area of special permits for nonconformities and those types of things that the planning board doesn't normally handle. So if something doesn't have to go to the planning board, it would normally be the responsibility of the ZBA. And there's no other planning board permit required. I'd like to understand why we're doing that and if that's a good idea.
Councilor Z was going to speak.
So I would first just have to show the list of clarifications. So speaking from a Ward 1 centric position, this is a pretty big range for me to understand. So in other words, if it's only single family homes, that's one line. If it's 2 families, then that's another line. If the parking garage is a transit station, that's a very different story. If it's not, I think the sponsors have referenced R1 a few times in the sense of maybe more like wards 5 and 6. But from a Ward 1 centric position, it makes a huge difference in what this actually means. So that's number one. Number two is to be more editorial or speak, opinion per se or thoughts. I think there's a little bit of loss of how controversial this is. In many years of experience, adding additional things on a lot is for a neighborhood, it boils the neighborhood. I mean, I've had to go to a million meetings about anything from an addition to a new this, and with short-term rentals, for example, that created another sort of, so anytime there's another, I know that the technical term use is not the correct one from open zonings, but just when you add more to an existing lot, this is really what brings the neighborhood out for or against. And I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect with that, and I think part of that disconnect is because the state is frankly taking over local zoning slowly but surely, which I'm sure is the subject of different people's opinions. My opinion is that was always a local thing, that was our bailiwick, that was our responsibility, but now it's at best a split responsibility. We have to, and the sponsors have clearly indicated, you have to sort of comply with the state law, but nobody from the state has to come down to work on and explain to residents, you know, if they're unhappy about a project. And that leads me to another concern, which is the whole concept of notice. It's kind of incredible to think that you might wake up one morning and you see a backhoe, and that's the start of a new unit being built in next door, potentially, you know, without having ever had any notice. That also is not congruous with years of experience and so forth. So that's a tremendous concern. And so the last thing I'll say, and I know I accept my negative Nelly hat, which is my role here. So I really see the value that it's talked about with the positive things that can come out of this. You know, the idea that it could be for a young, could be for a senior. But in my experience, most of these things end up getting exploited by developers. That's the reality I see in my experience. So if you could do a 2-family and now add a unit for 900 square feet and squeeze a few more dollars out of it, and then, you know, make that a rental, or, you know, these kinds of excesses happen all the time. And having lived through a number of projects where that ended up being the reality, unfortunately, the positives often outweigh the negatives during the conversation, but then you get out into the real world and you realize, like, they're just taking advantage of it, and they're not creating that affordable unit, they're not doing it. And if they don't have to provide parking, that's a tremendous value you've just given somebody. So you can have another 900 square foot unit on your property, no parking needed, because somehow the NEVA bus stop is going to count. So that goes back to my first point. And I will also congratulate the sponsors on a tremendous effort, because we have the state giving us a 2/2/25 date. But I personally have found myself consistently with MBTA, now this, and who knows what's next, questioning whether the city should continue to assent to things that make no sense, because they write things at the state level very broadly, and then they say, okay, here you go, and it doesn't always fit. Thank you again, and thanks.
Attorney North, they raised up.
Oh, yeah.
Attorney North, did you want to address the group?
Yes, just briefly, I just wanted to say, happy to work with you and your staff and the sponsors on these questions. I do just want to note for the record that the question about the transit station is not likely to be addressed or be able to be addressed. The SJC is hearing oral argument on the Milton MBTA case on Monday, and my guess is it'll be another 30 days or so at the earliest before we get any guidance there. So just FYI. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I just want to add one last thing. I think at the next meeting, what I would appreciate some of my ward counselor colleagues to maybe send me some examples of like properties, and we won't expose like residential, like, you know, too much detail, but maybe look at bird's eye view, because I think what we'll realize is our dimensional requirements will trigger a lot of special permits. I just really want to call that out. But it's always helpful to look at a couple of cases. And I think that'll be our exercise to maybe walk through. What are we looking at? So I welcome us employing some creative strategy to kind of bring us all, because I do think this is a good thing. That's why I started with the in-law apartments, because I think this is long in coming for our community. We're woefully behind. We should have done this a while ago, in my opinion. So we are advocates to make it work, but we want to make it work successfully.
So thank you to the two sponsors. I agree, we have to get ahead of this. Thank you for doing the due diligence. We do have another ordinance to do tonight too, so I would like to be respectful of that. I would like to continue this. I would look to my other two counselors in the planning and development committee. Okay. So, all right,
All in favor?
all right, so we've continued it.
Sorry, just wanted to clarify, because of protocols, just to make it clear for the planning board, we do have to continue to a date certain, just to clarify for folks, so we can do that in conjunction with the planning board.
So could I have a motion to continue this public hearing to the next meeting, which is October 16th?
I'll move to continue the public hearing to a date certain,
You're available?
October 16th.
So,
Second, okay. We don't have anybody remote, so we can do it by voice vote. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay.
Right, thank you. All right, October 15th. So next, we have the P5, which is ordinance 176. Also, it's a continuation from our last meeting in September. Councilor Zede, I believe, is the one sponsor here who can speak to it. I think the plan for tonight was to go through almost line by line. We can start that.
Late start for line by line. But,
Yep, it is.
I'm happy to, do this as reasonably quickly as I can. I know, the chair also asked me to speak to the three paths from last time. Do you still want?
Nope. A little late for the, late in the evening for that.
Okay. Yeah, so, in the last meeting, I think we were focused more on just the broad, approach. And I'm sure that still merits debate, because I realize people need to wrap their heads around the approach. So we didn't get to go through some of the particulars of the ordinance. I'm not gonna literally do line by line, but I think section by section to give you an idea of that, so I can do it in about 10 minutes or so. So, the first thing is, the form and structure of this is an overlay district, and so the whereas and really the purpose are designed to establish the uniqueness of the lot, which is typically a question mark when there's overlay districts, what justifies an overlay. And we make some arguments and intent statements as to why the Kmart site in particular is really worthy of consideration for an overlay district, whereas oftentimes can become a question and certainly that. The second one is the purpose, and the reason I want to just talk about that briefly, it's not an incredibly weighty paragraph, but just to clarify from the last meeting and really just try and get on the same page. The intent of this ordinance and the establishment refers to the area inside black dash lines. That is the last page by appendix, and I know we got a little hung up on that last time, and for good reason. But this is really the area that we're trying to discuss in the proposal. I will say that we acknowledge and we understand that there have been and are questions about should this be bigger than this black dash line? Should we try and address potential future development both within the plaza, so to say, and possibly beyond that, say across Low Street and so forth? I think that's a public policy debate. I can tell you from a sponsor standpoint, we are obviously trying to triage a situation that we view as happening in real time with this site. And so rather than maybe take too big of a bite all at once, we were trying to address the spot, but with the understanding that we just don't know. We don't know what intent might be for those other lots, and that there may be consideration for that. So the next part is the establishment of the district. So that continues on with the uses and regulations and just sort of some of those things. The next one is probably the most relevant when it comes to the approach, which is section 33C, which is the effectiveness dependent upon a contingent upon a development agreement. Long story short is that this basically says that the zoning and the development agreement are, they're siblings. So they essentially can't exist. One cannot exist without the other. And so the development agreement has been the subject of much conversation. But one thing that has been lost is that these are not easy, I think. And so we have talked about this on other areas of the city, which I won't mention tonight, but whether the development agreement comes with plan, the development agreement, all of those sorts of pieces are relevant, and we seek to address and define those here. You can see with the ABC, it runs with the lands. We try and contemplate instances where the current proponent doesn't necessarily continue with the project. For example, these are the concerns you have when you have these long-term projects. In this specific case, it's slightly mitigated by the fact that we are talking about effectively one project. But if this were to expand beyond that, then this becomes even bigger. Because what if you do some but not all, and what gives you give now, and you ensure that you get the sort of some of the other parts of that. So that's the first paragraph, and then the second paragraph is, we didn't write the development. So there isn't a draft development agreement attached to the back of this, and so we seek to say basically that, really that the core tenet of the development agreement we intend is that, we're going to get 25% of the units to be affordable, and that they are going to run them as rentals, and therefore, A, we get the 25%, B, we get the rentals, both of which are identified needs, and C, that we get to count the full load of units against our SHI. And that's that magic trick that EOHLC gives you if you can check off those two boxes, the 25%. So one differentiator here between this and 40B is that, 40B is a little bit more focus on this. There's more 20 to 25% conversation. So you may not get 25 if it does end up being a 40B, and I can certainly address that in a little bit. But that's just the nature of that beast. But for us, to the extent that as a city, through our typical means of deciding these sorts of things through this and through other means, if we decide that 25% and the rentals are important to us, then, and they are to me, to be very clear, that they are to my co-sponsor as well, that would be extremely important to get, and the development agreement would be the place to realize that, we think, and possibly more, but that's the next section is 33D, which is development standards. So first thing is to again hit the nail on directly with number one. This probably could be stricken or could be contemplated to be stricken just to avoid any lack of clarity. It seems clear that the developer is interested in building one ginormous building on this lot. Whether that's acceptable or not to the city, and whether we have enough leverage, so to say, to compel something different is a conversation. The livability of the development has come up a couple of times. The idea of building, one single very large building, it's a question mark. And I think in other contexts, say if we weren't facing 40B concern, would probably be top of mind. This is the massing, this is all the terms you hear all the time. So we can probably lay aside number one if we wish. We certainly can understand the developer seems to wish to really go with that there. And similarly with number two, we did contemplate that if there was any subdivision, we want the whole thing to go together. Because we thought there could be continuity to be created there as opposed to separating things out. Number three, looks like a lot, but what it does is incorporates by reference 40R. So rather than copying and pasting 150 pages of 40R, you have by reference again to several of the most relevant sections. These are tried and true, so to say, because we've had actual projects developed against them. So the process, the dimensional parking requirements, the requirements for affordability, which as you know in 40Rs is 25%. The permitting procedure, like all of these things need not be recreated, and so why recreate them, and B, why copy and paste them? You're creating two potential things that can get out of sync over time. So it's fairly straightforward. And then there's two sub-districts in smart growth and 40R. So we just said A was the bigger of the two. B is the one that's around the traffic circle. It's true out there. Number four is, where we get a little bit of differentiation, I would say, between 40R. So it's not a pure 40R, deviations or movements away from the direct 40R, but basically this establishes, and to the chair's questions earlier, what's the process, what board works through things. In this case, we establish a PAA, which is the Plan Approval Authority. It is the planning board, so you get another cool name out of many. And it's really the key here, I would say, is this isn't, I don't think this is a very novel thing. I think this is fairly straightforward, special permit type thing, because what I'm saying here is that we did make this as of right. So I want to be very clear about that. It's always a question mark, whether something will be a special permit, will be as of right. In this case, you see in the last line there, it says an as of right. That that is the nature of this. I do view that personally as a concession, but probably an important one. That's obviously something to the planning director's point. They want to see the end. They want to see a clear path to the end. They don't mind if they have to necessarily go through some things, but there has to be an end there. It can't be a journey with no finish, with no ending to it. Okay. And then going on to the next page, you know, we really get into, I think, at least traditional zoning type things, you know, maximum height, 4 stories, 45 feet. We did have a maximum footprint of 22,000. That obviously, if we sort of acquiesce to the single structure, probably needs to be probably in the 60s, is my understanding, high 60s, 68,000. We did ask for some open space. This ratio, doing it per dwelling unit is not atypical, but it is something that we thought would make it more livable, just to have some, you know, not covering the square inch of the lot. And then we did, just in context for the previous presentation, we asked for no waiver of the parking requirements. We would be intent for those to be hard, but those are the 40 yard requirements. I think most people feel that those have been reasonably successful, so it seemed like it would be sensible to continue with them. And then F is an interesting one. It actually calls for density with a minimum density. So remember, if you loop back to the concept of trying to hit SHI, we didn't want to go the other way and get too light a development, ironically, and then not achieve the goal on the other end. And I would refer to the director to give you SHI math if you want, but you know, we sort of have an idea of how many units we need to get there. And it's a finicky thing because whenever you build a new unit, you're mucking with both the numerator and the denominator. So math gets effective. We really need to get all the units to count, I think, to get that comfort factor. If we don't get all the units, I'm convinced we will hit SHI minimum, which is bad for risk of other 40Bs, but it's just also that's one of our goals. And if we can get it, I think we'll get a certain measure of durability. You never know, right? More units can come online and throw you back off. These census can happen, but we got to do the best for what we can. And then section 5 is really all about public infrastructure and potential future public costs, in my opinion. So we're really formalizing an ask here to DPS to basically give us, you know, some input on the availability of water, the availability of sewer, the transportation around the area. We're not asking them to make decisions, we're asking them to give information. And so we think that they should have that opportunity. I think there's a lot of conjecture out there about the resilience of our systems. And I think generally the understanding has been that maybe there's some level of capacity in the plants, but collections for sewer and distribution for water are potentially limited. We know that there's a lift station serving this area on Story Ave that may be a question. And we also know that, I mean, by common sense, if we add 212 units to this area, it's hard for me to know traffic. There'd be nothing, you know, nothing new is required. And that's bad for the people when they live there. I think most residents would attest and did the last meeting, the traffic be challenged down there. So I think then this is your usual boilerplate. So I'll just close by saying that I know the chair doesn't want the 40B conversation, but just to say we are in a tough spot. The unfriendly 40B is a risk that we face, and we try and mitigate that. One path is the mayor's path, which is trying to do a local initiative project, which is also known as a friendly 40B. Both of those really, they put the ZBA, the zoning board of appeals, becomes the board, and they essentially become the negotiating arm of the city. They work with the developer, they become omnibus. That's why they call it comprehensive permit. So they supersede. There is no local zoning, there's no conservation, if it were to apply, there's none of those things. And so they would work with that, and their goal is to try and issue a local permit as best they can without sending the developer over the edge to go to the state and appeal a denial, for example. So frankly, the city council is out of it, the planning board is out of it. Frankly, the executive branch is out of it as well. The zoning board becomes your central, negotiating body, if you will. And what the friendly 40B buys you is that you get some measure. This is my learning, so you can ask the attorney for your own research for yourself, but you buy yourself some measure of comfort on what the application will be when they go to ZBA. But anything can happen, and I think, again, we're really driving towards that 25% all rentals. And it doesn't seem, I guess, that you would get it. in those cases, and I think the defensibility of the development and all that, things that can be discussed. So that's why, we hope that this can get some consideration, and frankly, even if the lit goes forward, the sponsor and I talked about this, we were like, well, if the lit goes forward, what do you do? And I think there's still value to us showing an economically viable project. Some have said it's worked very little with the state, I'll take very little over time. And I really want to be able to tell residents, I did the best I could to drive a good outcome here, and if it goes out of our control, so be it. So a lot of effort, and if it becomes sort of rooted. So that was 10 minutes, kind of close. So I'll yield there and see.
Questions?
All the mics.
Thank you for the presentation, and the effort into this particular amendment. The main question I have is, in the past meeting, Attorney Lee had mentioned that what we were presenting, so I'm wondering, we've had discussions with them about this. You know, what the utility is and going forward, we're not going to be.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. First thing is, this is not meant to stop the project. So I think that's an important, just simple thing to say. I think the intent is to recognize being a tough spot for 40B, but not laying down and accepting absolutely everything we're given. So that's the push and the pull, whether that happens between the ZBA and the developer eventually in the 40B process, whether some of that is mitigated or slowed down by a friendly agreement, or whether it comes down to zoning. We have to try. I mean, that's what I'm kind of hearing from residents. You have to at least try. You can't just throw your hands up and say 40B, you can't do anything at all. So we really actually intended to give, in large part, what was asked by the developer, which I think will make some residents unhappy, understandably so. It's a big project. It's a dense project. It's a single building. It's at a place where it's in a tough spot. So to answer your question, yes, we have efforts were actually made prior to submission of this to communicate with the developer. We didn't hear back per se, but we did make further efforts afterwards. We're open to suggestion, I would say, on this, if this is a path that can have viability, and if it can't have the developer, I still think the city needs to do what it can. I'm on the city council. This is what I can do, so I'm doing it. So I don't know if that helps explain, but we're not going to stop and just give up. So we will continue through the process. We will remain working on a recommendation, like the previous sponsors, the changing language and words and things like that. But I don't think we should view our negotiating position as zero.
Any other questions from councilors or planning members? I have one question for sponsor and another question for Attorney North. In terms of the reference in the ordinance to sub-district A.
Yes.
I assume you've seen the MBTA proposal that is in process, and I wonder whether you had considered sub-district C as an alternate to that, or whether it's just too early for that point.
Yeah, we did. I mean, we did talk about it. We couldn't reference something that isn't codified yet. So the C is paper right now, at least as far as Muni code goes. But it's all a lot of timing problems with this, right? Because again, we're not in control fully of the process. If that could work through and there's a cogent argument for C, we can certainly consider it.
I just didn't know when you would look at it.
Yeah, we stuck with what's out there.
And then for Attorney North, I understand your opinion on the issue of impermissible contract zoning. I have a different question about this though. And this is not a substantive, it's really a process question. Do you think that the requirement for a separate development agreement would affect the as of right character of the ordinance for the purpose of a majority versus a 2/3 vote at the city council?
No, It's still going to be a 2/3 vote.
Oh, well, I'm just, what I'm saying is, this is it's presented as of right, so if that development agreement weren't there, then it would be a majority vote. But you're saying that it becomes a 2/3 vote because of the development agreement?
I'm sorry, you're talking about the approval of the approval of the underlying application. I apologize. Or do you
But
mean the approval
approval
of the zoning proposal
Yes,
in front of the city council?
yes.
Okay. There is nothing that I see in this language that changes this overlay requirement to something other than a 2/3 vote by the city
Really?
council.
But I thought the new section of the state law said that if you had an ordinance that allowed,
Oh, as of right
as of right,
Or-
multifamily,
for multifamily.
yes.
Yeah, no, you're right. I need to just take a look at the language carefully.
Okay.
I think that's a great question.
If I may.
Yeah, sorry, you're correct. And go ahead,
If I
Andy.
may, just one thing that may have implications on Attorney North's opinion is because, and as Councilor Dean pointed out, this is referencing the existing 40R district. And there are other uses that are allowed as permitted uses in section D. And given the way that the statute's written and combining different votes or substantive votes together, I don't know whether that in itself I think that may be what triggers here. So for instance, you could allow the residential use, and I think stick to that simple majority vote, but if you're combining other uses, because this is cross-referenced, unless you're excluding those other uses, you may be tripped up to the 2/3, I guess, and I just want to throw that out there as something I'm seeing based on the structure.
That's
I would
correct.
just answer, we have no idea, to be totally honest with you, because that provision is so new. With the MBTA, we had the same question, what's the quantum of the vote? Is it 8, is it 6? We went back and forth. We talked about whether other uses sneaking into the zoning, by allowance, change that vote to 8. I think the current working theory is MBTA needs 6. The working theory, if memory serves, that's where we ended that conversation. So I'm not sure we should try and answer that tonight definitively. Yes, I mean, if you're doing multifamily by right, they said 6, but. Right.
I think, again, I'll defer to Attorney North, and obviously we can follow this, but I think that seems relatively clear to me. I think the reason why, in the case of 40R district, I know going back to the discussions we've all had on that, the reason why that one isn't necessarily an issue to keep the commercial or other components in there is because it's an existing 40R smart growth district. So because that statutory provision about the voting did take into account the possibility of someone basically, having an existing 40R district. And again, I'll defer to Attorney North, but I think here we had the possibility, and only because we were working with an existing grandfather, for lack of a better term, 40R district, where because this would be a new district, it's not, just an expansion of the
Yeah,
existing.
but with due respect, that, I'm sure that's statutory. I mean, I've never read that in any of the 48 sections about grandfather. And that's an invention of the OHLC, in my opinion. I haven't read, I read guidance. I don't read it. The only thing I read in 48 is multifamily by right equals 6. Well, majority, which for us is 6. That's what I read. So I just want to say, like, let's ask the question, but let's not try and debate it here.
Yeah. Agreed. MBTA, I have a definitive ruling from a long conversation with the Attorney General's office, and I'm comfortable where that landed at majority vote. This, I need to do some of that same analysis, and I'm not going to do that on the fly tonight.
Thank you, Mary. Are there any other questions before we open the public? No? Okay, in that case, we'll open public comment on this. And again, please come to the mic and give your comment and try to keep your comments to 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Good night, good evening, sorry. It does feel like good night. Elizabeth Walker, 13 Eagle Street. I'm here tonight to express support for affordable housing. As many in the room share similar opinions, sure. But I need to state why I feel this way. I believe that the high cost of housing is one of the most dire issues facing our community. Our city is becoming increasingly unaffordable for both new residents and longtime residents. In just the 2 decades since my husband and I moved here, this community has become a place that we could no longer afford to move to as people who are just starting out and starting our career. And we are on a course we need to correct. We need to make it possible for people who work in our schools, run our programs for youth and seniors, answer our emergency calls, and keep our city running to afford to live here. We need to make it possible for our children who grew up here to make our home here. We need to make it possible for seniors to live out their years. And we need to make it possible for newcomers of any income level to make this place their home, just as so many of us have. So this is what will make us a community, a strong community, a resilient community, a diverse community. To do this, it is absolutely necessary that we support the creation of more housing options on multiple fronts, including the direct investment by the city, zoning changes, collaboration with developers, and redevelopment of city assets. To have an impact, we need to work together and we need to be strategic about our actions. We need to embrace change and be willing to get a little outside our comfort zone. To really have an impact, we need to be transformative in our thinking. That means getting comfortable with density, getting comfortable with development scales that we have not experienced in Newburyport. This doesn't mean we can't proactively guide new development and influence the outcome in a positive way in our community. We can still influence how that development looks, how it interacts with the area around it, how it supports our broader community goals related to affordability, resiliency, and economic vibrancy. I think important progress has already been made on the housing proposal for the Kmart property, and that we should acknowledge that progress and continue to work with the property owner to make that a reality. That being said, we can continue on multiple tracks. This development proposal can result in a project that has a significant and positive impact on our housing supply and can start to transform this area of our city into a mixed-use, vibrant area. I encourage us to continue that process. That doesn't mean we have to stop working on the rezoning for the rest of this area, which I believe has the greatest capacity to support the type of development we need. So let's continue on parallel tracks. Let's make use of the technical assistance grant the city received from the state to work on zoning for this area that will support the creation of housing and guide the development of this area in a way that brings greatest benefit to the community as a whole and the future residents who will live here. Let's make use of zoning experts, develop our professional staff to craft the zoning, and let's do it through a transparent process that engages the community and starts by setting goals for what we'd like to achieve here. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Nancy Salyers, at 6 Woodman Lane. I came here 2 weeks ago for the last meeting and spoke about transportation and the congestion of this area. I heard nobody speak against affordable housing or against this unit going up. But I am very concerned about the gigantic building. I am not against the development of the Kmart site. I would like something, though, that looks reasonable for the area. There's nothing above 4 stories in this area. And to get 200 units, it's gonna have to go. And I just don't think that's fair to us who live in this area to have a gigantic building going up and no one looking at the aesthetics of the area. People talk about aesthetics in the historic area of the downtown area. I think those of us who live here should also have something that fits into the neighborhood, not one huge group.
Thank you. Yes.
Good evening, Owen Smith, 175 Story Avenue. Really, I just kind of say, what's the intended outcome here? You know, we need to be working with the developer to get affordable housing, more housing in this community. You know, I've talked to people concerned about traffic, people wanting Trader Joe's there, Trader Joe's there. Supermarkets draw people in, shopping draw. We have a community here, people are gonna stay, the traffic's predictable, we can manage it, we have a favorable development agreement with the developer. You know, there's multiple multi-story buildings in that neighborhood. You know, developing it will look a lot better now than Barron, old abandoned Kmart. I hope, that this overlay district doesn't derail the progress we made. And maybe these city councilors can address the concerns with the process, which is we elect the mayor to represent the interests of the city. We have a strong mayor here. You don't want that? We can change our charter and become a council manager city. And then you all can sit in executive session all night and discuss the merits of it. Right now, and the chief negotiator for the city is the mayor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Judy Tynan, 39 Lime Street, and I just want to say that I agree with everything that Juliet Walker said. I think we do have a chance to make it look like a compatible, to look like a great neighborhood. There's a lot of possibilities out there, and there's a lot of opportunity for, local input from residents who live in the area. We do have a grant opportunity to look at rezoning that would include traffic considerations and the aesthetics of the area. But we do have to embrace change. It's going to be difficult. It's not going to create new housing is going to put us all of us out of our comfort zones. And we have to go there because this is what's going to make our community a vital community. Economically, the businesses are saying they need more housing. They absolutely desperately need more housing. People that Juliet talked, teachers and people who work in town, businesses need more housing. And eventually, with a population that is getting older, those people need housing as well. I think there's a lot of possibility for great development in this area. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Miriam BC, 10 Penn Street. I just want to affirm what Juliet and Judy said. We do need to change how we think of the city and how we're gonna really join a new age of desperate need for housing. We just have to do things differently than we do. And it means, and I think we can make it also look very good for the city. Even though it seems daunting to have a multi-story building in Newburyport. But we really need to do it because that we're just in desperate need of housing. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Stephanie Nikitich, 93 High Street. So the comments which I'm hearing, which are great comments, we need to increase affordable housing, diverse housing in Newburyport. I don't think anyone on this particular topic of the Kmart side has disagreed with them. It was the last meeting. I didn't hear anyone in that neighborhood saying we don't want, don't build anything. But I think that when you talk about aesthetics and the way things fit into the community, you do that through local zoning. And 40B is not. So I think that that's why it's so important that we do try to pursue the ordinance that's been. And, again, on all of these discussions about housing, Newburyport has been very good at checking every box the state gives us. We had one of the first 40 Rs. we have an inclusionary housing ordinance. We've had it for 7 years. We immediately got on with the MBTA communities zone. We immediately gotten on with the ADU zone. We're a good city. We're doing what the state is asking us to do. I think it's fair for us to be able to still control what happens in the Story Avenue area and at the Kmart site. So that's our best hope for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
That truck, 144 Bow Street, and this isn't my neighborhood, right? It's not technically my ward, but I'm right down the street from it. And I'm telling you that I would like this to get built as soon as possible. I am aware that the cars back up a little on Low Street during rush hour. I am also aware that some people are concerned about what it looks like. My 20-year-old son, when he looked at the rendering and the picture of it, said, wow, are they really going to build that here? That's awesome. So aesthetics are in the eye of the beholder, for one thing. And the reason he was excited about it is he was like, oh my God, is there going to be somewhere for me to live? Because right now there is not. And he's keenly aware that he, despite, working a full-time job here in Newburyport, cannot afford to move out of his parents' house, right? That's the reality. He can't start his life. Ditto for his older sibling, who also works a full-time job in New York. Cannot move out of their parents' house because there's nowhere for them to go. Building this, and yes, I know we all want it to be affordable, but building it is what we need to do. And so I, of course, support whatever we can get out of this development deal to make this walkable and open and clean. But, when we're talking about I heard the Ward 1 councilor say we were talking about making this livable development. Livable for who? If we're talking about aesthetics, that's more about us. I want this to be livable for people who are going to live there. And in the way that's drawn with a building that has these cutouts of open space, I don't think that's something really different than, asking for it's going to feel the same for people who live. But when we're talking about aesthetics, what's it like for someone who's desperately trying to find some place to live? I think it was, please support getting this done in a streamlined way. I trust the mayor on this. I think he's already been working. I would hope you would ask yourselves, is going down this zoning route going to do us more harm than, are we standing on principle or something that could then just be like, well, now you don't get anything you want? I think that would be a huge mistake. So please think about that. I know at the last meeting, someone said, counting on you to do this the best way possible. The best way possible is going to get us some housing. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Let's come forward.
Evening, everybody. How are you this evening? Well,
Could you give your name and address, please?
oh, I'm sorry. My name is Bill Melanson. I live at 217 Low Street. I control the lock and get to that building. My dad served on the city council in the city for 18 years. He was part of the original reconstruction project. Planners and non-developers built downtown when it went from the trash dump that it was to the beautiful thing that we have down there now. And a lot of people want to live here. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's really, really great. When I was 8 years old, there were 8,000 people living in this city. 8,000. Not 18,000, 8,000. We had horse farms. We had 2 movie theaters. We had bowling alleys. We had roller skating rinks. I worked at Kmart. This is where the school was, I went to school, formerly in James Hospital. And I'm looking at this. The way this is developed, the way their drawings look at this. They're gonna bring that building down to ground level on Low Street by their drawings. There's gonna be a significant runoff coming out of that park. I don't know if you guys know how much water. We already have problems with our infrastructure. When the new buildings were built, up behind the Dunkin' Donuts, those really, really nice apartment buildings. What happened to our water lines and sewer lines on Low Street? How many patches do we have down Low Street? I have 4 water main breaks within 100 feet of my house. We have a 100-year-old pipe running down that street for water. We have a 100-year-old pipe running down that street for sewer. We have a 100-year-old, almost a 100-year-old pipe running down that street for gas. That load on this infrastructure is gonna blow this whole thing up. If they're gonna do it, they better put pipes all the way down that street, end to end. You're gonna need to, it's gonna be a huge project. The loss of retail space. Newburyport is a dying city. When I was young, this community was vibrant. You could shop in this town. You didn't have to leave town for anything. Now you have to leave town for everything. God, there's just so much here all at once. We're talking about taking down a 53,000 square foot building and putting up 320,000. I've watched the Colby Horse Farm, which was agricultural land zoned for 100 years, turned over for profit. Oh, if we get enough money to the city, they'll change the zoning on it, and we can stick some houses in there. I have the land dump behind my house. With all the stuff that went on with that, the lawsuits, the whole thing. I support all of this. You mentioned the traffic backs up. I live almost a half mile from the top of the intersection at Storiette. I can't pull out of my damn driveway because I have cars all the way down the street because we didn't have the foresight to put an off ramp on Hill Street to direct all of that traffic. All the traffic has been pushed onto Low Street in this city. All of it. All the big trucks, all the cars, the industrial park coming in and out. When they built the new Bresnahan School right here, which, by the way, used to be all of our athletic fields. I look over here, I see a football field, I see 2 basketball fields, I see a basketball court, I see an ice rink that used to be over here. That all got taken out so we could plot the new school over here. We were promised as a neighborhood that traffic was going to be diverting out this way. That, the entrance is High Street, and there's North Atkinson Street. Well, you guys know it's all one way, right? So all of those cars dump into our neighborhood. I was here for the widening of Low Street. Low Street was a family neighborhood. It was a winding back road. I don't know if anybody here is. It was a winding street, barely paved. Now it's a freeway. I've been hit snow blowing and cleaning in front of my house 3 times. 3 times hit, brushed by cars going down the street. Generally, you get the finger.
Could you,
I'm sorry, I will wrap this up. They're looking to really to build this. The amount of traffic, the amount of infrastructure they're going to bring on, and really, really nice presentation. And his comment was, we know the neighbors will be upset because there's going to be more traffic and more of this and more of that. But it's already there. My property value has been destroyed by what has been done with the north end of this city in the past 15 years. It's turned into a nightmare. I love living here. It's harder and harder and harder to stay. Now, you were talking about your kids want to live here, affordable housing, right? 25% off retail, am I roughly correct on that? 25% off of what retail rent would be is what the affordable housing is going to be. That apartment up there, make no mistake, that little 1-bedroom apartment is still going to be $2,200. And if your kid's making $15 an hour, that's $2,400 a month. That's no food, that's no nothing. if they're gonna do this project, they really need to look at the infrastructure. Because at the end of the city, we've been taking it for years. And I appreciate you guys looking into it. I'm sorry, I'll shut up. It was just so much. It's really wild. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your comment. Is there anybody else who would like to speak to this proposal? Is there anything online? In that case, I will close the public comment and bring it back to councilors and planning board.
Are there questions? We want to, and Councilor Z as the sponsor, how do you want to proceed?
What, which is to go home. So I think continuing tonight is understandable, it's been a long night. We know we need to do a little bit more work. So it's fine. I don't know if anyone wants to stay on for the ride. I would prefer that, but certainly not looking to send it out. It needs help.
Understood on that. Are there any comments that we want to give them? Do we want, so if we're going to continue this, do you want to continue it to 16th or do you want to continue it to another day? Because I think doing 2 in 1 night.
So my question is whether we want to continue the public hearing, or whether we want to close the public hearing and continue deliberations on it. Is there
a desire?
Any question about that? Or?
Well, if I may just offer for your consideration, I know sometimes there's the two paths you taken versus the board staying together, only to the extent to which the sponsors might have a revision to it. You may want to, have that discussion of the hearing and so forth together. I'll get back to you, but that may be beneficial.
I think we should keep it open.
Okay. Do we have the proper, in terms of our schedule?
So we did November 6th. We have MBTA communities ready that night. Now, I don't think that's going to be a lot. I think if we're going to do it, I would not do this the same night as the ADUs. I would say the 6th.
Okay. Is that acceptable to the board members to postpone to the continue November 6th? If I start with a motion from our side.
I'll move to continue the public hearing to November 6th.
Okay, second, all those in favor? Any opposed? Okay.
And just so everyone else knows, we will do the bulk of the work. Hearing's done. So. Yep.
Understood, but to me, this is more prescient than the ADU conversation. Understand we have a February timeline for the ADU conversation, but we also need to keep in mind that the development agreement that the administration is working on is going on right now, and it could very well be that they would leapfrog this, and then this is just completely lost. So I would say this is more prescient than the ADU conversation. What happened to the ADU?
Because we've already moved it to the 16th already. That was already voted on.
Well, that was very poor planning on our part, but okay. But I think we do very much need to recognize that this may be completely moot by November.
But could I just say that, the public hearing needs can and will continue jointly, but planning and development can meet.
Yeah, we can meet.
We can have a council conversation if we so choose through the committee on a different timeline, because I agree, we're not the sponsors driving all the buses, right? So there's the parallel tracks you mentioned a few times, and that, there's more than one thing happening. But that could be another avenue if we can't swap them.
Sorry, I just want to ask one more question. But so if we were to work on this as a planning and development committee, but not with the joint planning, with the planning board, we still couldn't bring this ever to council for a vote, could we, if this was still open? So we could do work in the background, but we couldn't
We have a couple things. We have the zoning timeline, it's not boring. We also have, we ask for, we get a recommendation from the planning board. I don't know. I'm on 60 days, if I'm certain that it's 90 days for the overall.
Yeah.
So this is,
The hearing had to open, so we
Right.
satisfied that.
Right.
We have not yet closed the planning board's hearing, so that clock doesn't start running until this hearing is
And
closed.
it counts for the point. I don't think anybody's trying to rush, but I do think there's an idea that, we have timeliness consideration here that is relevant, is real.
Sure. So we can do this on the 16th and we can do two ordinances the same night.
Well, I guess.
I mean, I do, hang on, and we have the option of doing another plan and development committee meeting next week, on the 8th. Because our next scheduled one is October 22nd. So I mean, I'll defer to my council members. If you want to continue a meeting next week on this topic, we can.
But you're saying no matter what, the next,
Our next currently scheduled meeting is the 22nd.
yeah, so the 16th. So you're talking
Yes, sir.
October 16th.
Yeah, October
To have
16th.
another public forum.
Right. Yeah. Well, October 16th is our next joint planning board meeting, which we're going to do the ADUs. If you want to do this one as well, we continue to then. We also have October 8th, next Tuesday. We want to have a planning and development committee meeting on this topic. We can do that.
I think it would be most fair if we handled Peapod first on the 16th and ADU second, given none of us are feeling terribly fresh. I think at this point, given how long we're at this, so maybe give the fresh first position to Peapod and then.
That's fine. We can do that. Is that something that you want to, you need to change your vote here?
So we also have the Recreation Youth Center on the 16th. It's a huge meeting. It could be considered, but it's going to be another midnight meeting. And we have to figure out what kind, I mean, we'll have to figure out what the sequence of, I mean, a lot of the same people are going to want to be here for Recreation Youth Center as for.
Well, I think unfortunately, if you don't do the 16th tonight, then that option is gone. So my respectful request would be, can you do the 16th and then if we need to continue it from there? We can, but if you don't run the 16th tonight, that option is lost. Can't come back. And so.
Does that mean it goes to the ADU then?
Well, we can decide that particular sequence separately, but I guess that would mean that we would have to reconsider our recent vote and then revote. So would anybody like to move to reconsider last vote, which is continuing it to November?
I'll move to reconsider our vote on the motion.
Okay, all those in favor? Any opposed? Okay, now could I have a motion to continue our public hearing to October 16th?
I'll move to continue our hearing to the October 16th.
Thank you. All those in favor? We'll figure out what the sequence is, because these are three important things, and last one may get short, so I'll work with the planning director.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So with ours,
Motion to continue to October 16th.
your second,
Second.
all those in favor, say aye. All right.
Good morning, Chair.
Motion to adjourn?
Yes, second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay,
Do you want to meet?
let me give a couple of minutes for everybody to leave.
We didn't do,
And.
should have.
I don't know.
Hearing. Okay, continue.
Okay, let's. lost a couple
Jamie's
members. Yeah, longer break. Way over there.
Yeah.
She. Oh. Yes, because we're gonna go. This how you do it. Change that, we have to find figure that.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah, so this is my.
You sketch?
Let's
see that, yeah, because I was trying to do that. I was gonna do that.
We have. I'm sorry. I didn't, we have.
Trying to visualize that.
Doesn't sound like-
I know.
It's gonna be. I know what we'll do. Yeah.
Keep it all set.
Oh, that's it, okay. So, our next order of business is,
It's a continued, yeah.
continued public hearing for City of Newburyport, 59 Low Street, major site plan review, and I understand there is another request to continue.
There's a request to continue to the meeting on the 16th. And I know we were just talking about zoning matters being continued that date, but that's the date the applicant had requested to continue to, I think our original assumption was they might be first on the agenda. We advised them that they may be pushed because of zoning matters. They were fully aware that that night, hoping that the zoning matters.
So could I have a motion to continue this to October 16th?
Motion to continue 59 Mill
Yes,
Street
yeah.
to October 16th.
Second. Any discussion? None, all in favor? Okay, and moving on to general business, and I think we're gonna pass these minutes on to the
next agenda.
meeting. Yeah. And Caitlin, you have to set us the fork. We don't have the 16th.
I'll get you.
Okay, great. So then we move on to the next item of general business, which is the consideration of 3 Center Street. We had I'm not sure how much you want me to say about this, but we had an executive session at our last meeting, and out of that came the possibility of a vote to reconsider our the vote that we took on September 4th, which resulted in a denial. It was a motion to approve, but the motion failed. And so I guess, we have to think about if we want to make a motion to reconsider. Again, if we did that, when we would, what date we will do the reconsideration. And I don't know if you want to say anything further about that, Andy?
We'll defer to Kara Soros, our attorney as well, who's with us, but I guess the only thing I would say is just that, again, this is just my perspective as as planning director, but recognizing that we do, the board did have the opinion of council at the time, and that it may be then difficult for council to defend the board's decision if it's in disagreement, if the rationale is in disagreement with council. That seems sort of at least reasonable to ask the question, is that the path the board wants to go in, recognizing that again, I'll just look at it from my own lens, like that's probably a pretty big piece of what the court would be looking at. Is saying, is this, sound judgment? And, I think here they're gonna be looking back and saying there's an immediate contradiction there between the board's finding and what was conveyed by council. So from my perspective, it seems at least reasonable to reconsider, to discuss the possibility of reconsidering that, as opposed to going down a path where it would seem perhaps out of the gates that, it may not be a viable outcome, but I'll leave that to you folks. I don't know if Karis,
Yeah, I just want to add, and Andy, I think that's a perfectly fine summary. I just want to add to please be careful as you are discussing whether or not you want to reconsider, to not discuss some of the details that we discussed in executive session. That's all. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
I guess one question for me would be, when you say not to discuss any of the details that we discussed in the executive session, did I just step over the line by doing that?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure what it's not really clear what the,
If I can try to help a little bit, I think that you can ask factual questions, but you should try to refrain from any detailed discussion of the legal advice and strategies that we discussed and potential issues and outcomes. If that's a little more.
yes.
Oh.
Okay.
So I'm prepared to make a motion.
Okay, yeah.
Without any projection as to outcome, I'll make a motion to reconsider the September 4th decision of the board, which resulted in denial of the 3 Center Street permit application. And I would recommend, based on schedules, not the least of which is what we just rescheduled for, that we reschedule this to November 6th, I believe.
6th, okay.
I'll second that motion.
Is there any discussion on it? This is just discussing whether we're going to actually consider it again. And understanding that this is not reopening the public hearing, it's just reopening our deliberations. Heather, did you have anything you want to say?
I just have a question. So, and for me or anybody else who wasn't here September 4th, are we just observing in that meeting, or are we actually discussing as well? We did not contribute to the vote.
That's a good question. Attorney North?
Yeah, on a motion to reconsider, it's not a motion on the substance, it's a procedural motion, so I don't think that it's up to you. If you feel that you have enough information to participate and vote, participate and vote. But you're not voting on the actual substance of the application. You're just voting on the procedural question.
Yes, but then moving forward to night when we do reconsider, do the same members have to be part of the deliberations?
So, yes, anybody who was eligible to vote on the original application, as long as they are obviously present, then they can continue to vote on the reconsideration if you vote to discuss and potentially reconsider.
So
essentially rewinding the clock to the same members that were eligible, right?
yes, but I guess the question, they don't have to be the same people who were at the original meeting that we voted.
They have to be the same people that were at the original meeting that voted, unless, yeah, I mean, they have to be the same people that were at the original meeting that voted. If they're not available for the next meeting, that's fine, but there's nothing that you've done in the interim that would disqualify anybody under Mullen from participating.
Are you thinking of some member that wasn't there that could then participate in the vote?
Yes.
Because they weren't there for the final hearing, but they had at least listened to one of the tapes,
Yes,
for
right,
instance.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, if they complete the requirements under the Mullen rule, then they can participate and vote if they've
Okay.
only missed that one hearing.
Thank you, that's exactly right. Okay. Any further discussion about this motion? If not, then I will ask for a vote. All those in favor of the motion to reconsider on November 6th?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney North.
Yes. So the last thing that's listed on our agenda is the review and approval of housing production plan. I think it's somewhat late. So I think that we don't actually have terrible time pressure to take care of this. But I would encourage you all to take a look at it. I went through it with the Planning and Development Committee, and I think there's a lot of meat in there, but there are also a lot of questions. So I would encourage you to take a look at it if you can, and we will hope we can get to it on the 16th. Is there anything else?
No, thank you. Just to note briefly, the city council had voted Tuesday night, last night to just this week already. To vote to approve the housing production plan, recognizing, of course, that we're still gonna make a few.
That was the committee.
That was the committee, sorry, the committee of the council, will recommend out to the full council at the next meeting. Obviously, the hopeful presumption is that the full council will recommend or adopt the same, but the committee did recommend to the full council. And the two prerequisites before we can send this off to the state are both the planning board and city council. So, to Rick's point, if you could take a look between now and the next meeting when we're discussing this, irrespective of what it is, and we'll keep it on the agenda and take it up appropriately at that time, so it's not too late. If you could take a look and let us know any particular questions, concerns, thoughts you have on changes or edits or additions, that way we can do a quick turnaround, one set of edits, the final version, and get it out to the state. That'd be great.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have anything they would like to bring up at this?
Certainly, if there are detailed comments on the Peapod, can we circulate those comments prior to
the next meeting? Yes, I mean, just in general, what we would normally do is, for instance, if the gentleman a moment just ago came up to me and said, I want to give some written comment. Typically what we do is, and you might notice, Diane on our website will post those. We'll actually post them with the ordinance. So it would be posted as public comment, as if you were seeing public comment in OpenGov with the application. We would add it there, and that would be the way that you could go and look.
I think he's asking about if you have particular.
If I have.
Oh, I'm sorry, if you do.
Yeah.
I would suggest rolling those out at the meeting, if you will, as opposed to, I wouldn't want to run into a situation where you're essentially deliberating by email, because even us forwarding it from there would be essentially, by relay. So I'd suggest basically bringing those to the meeting and.
Well, could they be sent to you and that you could distribute them to the board?
Well,
with your report?
I guess what I'm saying, I guess what I'm saying is, my concern with that is, we can't staff can't serve essentially the purpose of facilitating deliberations outside the public hearing is my concern. So it doesn't matter that you're passing it through me. Essentially, you're still sharing in the deliberation or questions or dialogue there potentially. So if there are questions, that's one thing. If it's, substantive sort of.
It's comments.
It's comments. I think that might be delving into deliberations, but
Right.
yeah.
I'm just asking, I'm trying to expedite the process.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. I mean.
I completely appreciate that. I'm not.
There's no way these could be posted, his comments could be posted as a regular citizen. It would be different.
I apologize. We just let Karis North go, the attorney, but I just, from my experience, I don't know how we could, if the board members are all, look at that same comment, I don't know how we treat that as any different than, my concern is that might not be, it may be treated as essentially deliberations that are happening outside the public forum. I don't, again, I'm not saying that couldn't be done, but I'm concerned that we kind of steer as far with that.
It does, I mean, it would be nice when we're going through 3 rounds of continuation.
I contemplate these things all the time because frankly, getting any zoning change done and things is very difficult because of these procedural, hurdles and committee meetings in weeks and months.
It's that level of detail that we weren't really at.
No, we didn't get to it. Or we had to get into it, and then it may result in another continuation.
Yeah.
Okay.
It may be possible for us to, if you could talk to me, maybe it may be because of the questions you're asking, it might be things we'd be asking anyway. So to some extent, some of those, if they're questions or things, could be included within our staff report, just to clarify. There may be some way of addressing some of the things you're talking about that way, but I just want to make sure we're not going into the.
Yeah. Is there committee meeting? It's public.
Theirs will be public, yeah.
Yeah, but if no comment.
They take public comment.
They do? Okay.
Okay. Anything else? Get out of here before.
Early meeting.
We got 2 hours.
What do you want to do?
Could
I move to adjourn.
All in favor?
Before you have carried away today.
Thank you, everybody.